The best Reddit stories of all time. Story 1. Narrowly avoided being sent to prison for 10 to 20 years. One day I was just hanging out at home with the GF. We went to the Circle K a few houses down and got some beer. The clerk, who I knew pretty well at this point, asked if he knew where I could get a dub sack. When I was in high school and the few years after, my primary source of income was selling pot. I said sure, and that I'd be back soon. I go home and forget about it. An hour or two later, I'm like, oh shit, remember, weigh it out and go back. He had already given me the money, very important detail for later, so I waited until he had no customers. He came out and we went around the icebox, just smoking and chatting. I handed him the bag. Now, there was no one around. Empty lot except for this beat-up Volvo facing the record store next door. If I had been paying better attention, I may have noticed this Volvo had completely tinted windows, which seemed odd to do on a beat-up Volvo. Two men get out of the car and approach us. One tall, skinny guy wearing 100% denim and another guy who looks like Dog the Bounty Hunter in a beige sweater. They approach us and ask how we're doing. Me and clerk look at each other like, you know these guys? Then all of a sudden, the flash badges and yell, EPD. You're under arrest, and cuff us, separate us, and search us. Beige Dog goes through my texts, finds a couple dubious ones, a few crumpled up 20s, starts trying to get me to admit to doing a lot of business today, blah blah. Then they surprise me by walking me and my GF back to my porch, saying they've seen me come and go quite a bit and just want to make sure you don't have a pound of heroin in there, and they'll just charge me with a misdemeanor. Otherwise, it will be jail and a felony. So here we are, on my front porch, me saying there's no way I will let them in my house and to call my lawyer over and over. At one point, my roommate walks out, says hi, gets in his car and leaves. At this point, Dog explains that if I don't let him search the house, he's going to park a few squad cars on the lawn, extract everyone from the house and wait on a warrant, and they will charge everyone in the house with every little thing they find in any room. I now know this is not legal. Then, I was just scared. My roommate that had just left was a total nerd with a great job. Straight edge. Rarely drank and never smoked or anything at all. I was terrified of him losing his job. Unfortunately for me, I had just had an opportunity to get a quaff of mushrooms at a steal of a deal. My area was super dried up on mushrooms at the time, so I asked around and basically had all my deals set before I got it. This timing was perfect, because just 30 feet away on the coffee table of my bedroom was 1/4 of a lb of mushrooms, neatly weighted out into ounces and January 8ths. Top that with all the pot in there. It wasn't looking pretty. So, I proposed that I let one of them in to search just my bedroom and be done with it. I knew once I let them in they could do whatever, but I was out of options. Beige Dog agrees. Canadian Tux stays with my GF, who looks terrified like, WTF are you doing at me? And Dog the Sweater Hunter enters with me. I lead him upstairs and walk right past my door, which thank God was closed, and into the straight edge guy's room. Dog completely turns it over, takes out drawers, turns the mattress over, the whole shebang. As he does this, I quietly turn off the computer monitor with a background of my roommate and his GF glaring on it. Guy finds nothing, sticks with his agreement, and walks me and my shit-eating grin back downstairs. My GF, probably assuming I'm going to prison for many years, is looking like she's about to die, but I'm just grinning. Guy still fucking charged me with a felony. Then they leave. Long story short, paid a lot for a great attorney who was friends with the prosecutor. Since no money was seen to be exchanged, the charge was knocked down to deliverance of marijuana. The prosecutor recommended the minimum sentence. I paid in $121 fine, did 80 hours of community center at a local music venue, saw a ton of shows for free, and retired from selling. Story 2. I saved a man's life, and I never saw him again. 10 years later, this is still the craziest thing that has ever happened to me. In high school, I worked as a lifeguard at a country club for a few summers to earn some money. It was a cushy gig. It was for country club members only, so a large part of the job was learning people's names and interacting with them. Mostly just saying good morning, Mr. Garrity, and listening to some generic mumbling about millennials. Well, over the 4th of July weekend, there were more people at the pool than usual. Each member could sign in one guest, and there was a middle-aged man jumping off the diving boards who I hadn't seen before. He was over 6 feet, at least 230 pounds, and was doing gainers off the low dive into the pool to make big splashes to impress his country club member friends. Well, one particular jump he got a running start and slipped off the board at the very end. His momentum was already leaning backwards to do the jump, and his body came off the board a few feet, and his head rotated backwards and smacked right into the diving board. I can still hear that cracking sound in my mind. I'm sitting 8 feet off the ground in the lifeguard chair at the diving well watching this all go down, and I am praying that I don't have to do anything, even though I knew shit was about to go down. I didn't see any blood, which was a good sign, but as I watched his body sink down, I counted 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. No movement. I blew 3 short tweets on the whistle, the cadence to signal to the other guards that I would need the neckboard, and jumped in with my buoy, making as little of an impact as possible in the water. My lifeguard training took over as I dove down 8 to 9 feet to grab this dude. He was out, just making no movement whatsoever. Like I said, he was a big dude, but he wasn't as heavy in the water as I grabbed him and kicked us both up to the surface. I hoisted him onto the buoy and swam over to the edge, where by now the other guards had stuck the board down into the water. I lined up his limp body with the board as we all worked together to strap him into the board. The other guards pivoted the boards out of the water while I climbed out. I took a half-second look around to a half-dozen shocked faces, and it became clear to me that this was my show. Great. Still obeying my adrenaline-fueled rote memory of my training, I shouted for someone to call an ambulance as I made a decision. See, I thought he probably had a neck injury. The board he was strapped into is designed to not move his head, so he doesn't further injure his neck or back. But he wasn't visibly breathing, so I had to save his life at whatever cost it took. Or at least that's what my 16-year-old brain decided. So I started chest compressions. What they don't tell you about chest compressions is that you are breaking shit. You can feel bones and cartilage cracking under your palms. It feels horrible. I still haven't been able to shake that feeling. 1 round of 30, and then I did 2 breaths into his mouth. His head was already tidal back a bit from being in the board, so I didn't have to move his neck. After 2 breaths, I went back to chest compressions, and after 5 or 6 a little water leaked out of his mouth. He coughed a few times, and the other guards picked up the board and whisked him away so fast I didn't even know what happened. I rolled over onto the concrete, a tinnitus-like ringing in my head, my heart racing, just sitting there taking it in. I went into some trance as my teenage body struggled to deal with what just happened. Start to finish, it probably only took about 6 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime of stress and nausea had built up in my body. I was walked over to the guard shack, dried off, and walked up to the country club's nicer member buildings. The manager, who was a friend's dad and had gotten me the job, sat down with me as we talked about what happened. I gave him the basic details, signed some documents, and was sent home for the day. Like I said, I was in some kind of trance and was just operating on autopilot. I'm not sure how much sense I was making at the time, and it took me several hours to process what just happened. I came back from my shift a few days later, and I was told by another lifeguard that the guy was okay. I was thanked profusely by the member who brought him as a guest, but I never saw that guy again. This was still the craziest thing that has ever happened. I'm glad my instincts took over and I remembered my training. I might not have done everything exactly right, but I tried my best, and at the end of the day he lived through it. I hope that guy's doing okay. Story 3. I'm from Belgium and have traveled a lot with my parents when I was younger. When I was still together with my ex-GF, we traveled a lot as well, but neither of us had been to the USA, so we told this to a befriended couple, and a few beers later we started planning a trip to go on together. Because another mutual friend was studying in Philadelphia for a year, and we might as well go visit him. First we went to New York and Philly for a few days, then took a plane to LA, rented a car, and took a road trip to Cali, Nevada, and Utah. During this road trip, we'd often laugh about some of the dumb shit we'd heard or seen people do in America. We had a bunch of jokes about people in smaller villages and all kind of crazy stuff they might do. We had just been to Sequoia National Park, and we were looking for a place to spend the night and eat, because it was getting late. Found some old farmhouse where we could stay in one of the fixed-up cabins and asked the old lady who rented it to us where we could go and eat something. Mind you, this little town was called Pinehurst and had an extremely low population. She pointed us to the Pinehurst Lodge, which was basically the only restaurant/bar/store for miles. Went there, ate an amazing meal, and decided to grab some drinks afterwards and shoot some pool. As we were playing pool, this old giant approaches us, wearing a jean shirt that said George W. Bush, picture of an eagle. He had a bushy mustache, looked very tough for his age. And we thought he was going to give us trouble about using the pool table and laughing too hard. He is to this day one of the kindest people I've ever met. He asked if we were having fun and if he could join us. He bought us moonshine, which we obviously thought was hilarious, and we bought him a few beers as well. Had a blast the entire evening. While we were playing and drinking, the phone behind the counter kept ringing, but none of us was paying attention to it. By 23:30, all of a sudden, a woman comes barging in with a gun in her hand, looks at us, and stomps over. I felt myself getting nervous and getting ready to react if I had to. She stops behind our new friend, grabs an empty beer bottle and smashes it on his head. We were all perplexed with what happened. She proceeded to shout insults at the man and started hitting him. He calmly tells her to relax, turns towards us, shook our hands, told us that if we ever came back to be sure to let him know so we could hang out again, and then went outside with the woman. As we stood there, still trying to understand what just happened. The woman at the bar just shouts at us, "That's his wife. He's a bit of a social butterfly," and she had already called 10 times to ask when he'd come home. We thought it was pretty cool and all, so we told her, "Oh, okay. We're just going to leave as well then. It's getting quite late." "Oh, no, my dearies. It's best you stay a little while longer." The shouting you hear outside is still them arguing, and I can tell she's quite pissed at you guys because she blames you that he hadn't come home yet. And I have to say it wouldn't be the first time she shot at someone for keeping him too long at the bar, so best you stay a little bit until they leave. So we stay about 30 more minutes, all the while they keep shouting outside. Then we hear a car start and see a white truck speed off. Within seconds, we see a second truck speed after the first one. This was in the mountains with very narrow and bendy roads. Both cars just leaving at an insane speed. We hear the bartenders say, "She drives our children to school with the bus, you know." This would never happen at home. 100% would go back to Pinewood Lodge in a few years. Story 4. I'm a pretty avid cyclist, which means whenever I have the time, I will ride my bike away from the city I live in, into the mountainous suburbs to challenge myself up some of the local climbs. It was another one of these excursions. I had just rode up and down a big-ass mountain, on the road headed back to the city center. I was fairly tired, still had 40 kilometers to get back home. All of a sudden, I see traffic on the opposite lane stopped for some reason. What I immediately saw next I was not prepared for. I saw an ostrich on my lane, in front of me, running after the car ahead. WTF, it's not like the country I live in is habitat to any ostriches. Slowly, I follow the ostrich, which is running after the car ahead, faced with a decision. Do I overtake the ostrich? Now I'm no expert on ostriches, but I do remember reading that ostriches run really quickly, and that they can be aggressive towards humans. I don't want to become the victim of an ostrich attack, but I do want to get home quickly, as it was starting to get dark. After hesitating for a while, I gave it all I had and overtook the ostrich. The rest isn't that interesting. I managed to get home unharmed. But to this day, it remains one of my most surreal experiences, running into an ostrich on a bike ride. Story 5. 3 to 4 years ago, I was living in this bigger European city, 2 million people, for some years now. I went with a girl to a pub, and since all tables were full, we sat at the bar. There was an older guy sitting next to me, 50-ish, white hair, smoking a cigar, who kind distracted me because he reminded me of my uncle. Now mind, my uncle was living in the US for around 25 years already. He didn't look like that dude, nor did he act too similar. That bar guy just had some gestures that reminded me of him, mixed with the look of another distant relative. Sue. The girl I was with goes to the toilet, so I can't hold back anymore and look this dude in the eyes and tell him he reminds me of my uncle. He jokingly asks, "What's his name?" I tell him, and also tell him, Wheel. He lives in the US and works in field_of_work. And then the guy looks stunned and tells me the names of my whole family. Turns out he was the flatmate of my uncle 30 years ago for about half a year. That was definitely one of the weirdest bar stories I experienced. Story 6. I met a MILF on Tinder who was super nice and generous to me. First date was dinner and then sex at her place. The sex was awesome. On our second date, she brought me a shirt, a watch, and a bracelet. After that, we chatted over the phone for a week, and the best part about her was whatever I asked her, she used to just say, "Okay, let's do it," in excitement. New sex position, "Okay, let's do it." Smoke weed? Yes, let's do that. Public sex? Yes, sir. Anal sex? Sure. Never heard her saying no to anything. On our fifth date, she invited me to go out with her on a holiday for the weekend. I was low on cash, but she took care of everything. She booked the hotels and took care of the traveling expenses. We had a great time, except at night she got super drunk and started acting weird. She asked me what was my name again. She told me that she has a kid and is married. Started crying in front of me and started saying that she is in love with me and wants to ditch her absuing husband and marry me. I acknowledged everything she said and tried to console her. I thought she'll be okay by morning as she was drunk. The next thing I know, she started giving me a blowjob at night around the beach and told me to fuck her right there. I didn't have condom, so I told her I'll get that from the room, and the next thing she said was, "I would love to have your kid inside me." Nope. Just nope. Story 7. So me and my brother are fraternal twins. My stepmom passed away due to breast cancer when we were around 15 years old. She was like a second mother to us and had been around since we were very young, 5 years old. Now fast forward to our junior year of college. I attended a school in upstate New York while he attended a university in the state of Florida. One night, I woke up in sweat with tears coming down my eyes. I had the most vivid dream. I was in a house and my stepmother was there. I knew she had passed in this dream, which was a first for me. She hugged me, told me how handsome I had become, and that she loved me. I woke up drenched in sweat thinking, WTF was that? I didn't say anything to anybody and went to class. As I'm walking back to my apartment after class, I get a call from my brother. His first words were, "I know this is going to sound weird, but I had the most vivid dream about Maggie last night." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as he went on to describe the same dream I had just experienced the night prior. We've never had a twin moment like this, and I don't really know what to make of it. Story 8. I moved to Amsterdam. Housing situation was really bad. Couldn't find anything for a correct price range. I found a job working in a hostel and started looking nice into alternatives. Stayed camping for over a month. Anyways, I was seeing a lot of houseboats and it got me interested. Started looking into the laws and whatnot. You actually don't need any license to drive a boat, under 12 meter long, in the Netherlands, so I started looking for boats. I found a boat in Leeuwarden, in the north. A really nice couple were selling their 7-meter cabin sailboat. Took me 2.5 hours to get there by train and 3 days to sail back. It was the first time I had ever sailed a boat. Here's the catch, though I didn't sail it, I used its small propeller engine to get me back to Amsterdam. On the way, the rudder broke. I had to makeshift a new one to get back on road as I was working the next day. The engine died twice in the sea, and I was stranded near the coast, got cheeky near nightfall, and thought I could make it to the next marina across the IJmuir. The sea got really bad. I was super scared the rudder would break or engine would die, but I made it in one piece in the end. Been living on the same boat for the last couple months. Story 9. About 19 years ago, 3-year-old me, my mom and dad come home to find our cat Nubs is missing. The entire family turns the entire apartment upside down, but no trace of our cat is found. My mom decides to make missing flyers even though all the doors/windows were locked at the time. Days turn into weeks, then into months. She finally comes to terms with the fact that her cat is gone and has disappeared. Cut to last year, LOL. My grandma out of the blue says she lost Nubs. She says while we were out shopping, she decided to go to the mall across the street and took my baby stroller to hold extra bags. While she was in the middle of the mall, Nubs, unbeknownst to her, wakes up and jumps out of the bottom mesh pouch under the seat and takes off. My grandma, being too nervous and scared to ask for help, just leaves the store and our cat there. He was coming home like half an hour after she gets back home. She helped us look for this damn cat too, LOL. It makes me hysterically emotional to think about what happened to my mom's favorite cat. Story 10. I went to college in Kentucky, and it had a full-blown equestrian program. My second semester, I needed an elective since I'd tested out of half my Gen EDS and completed the rest my first semester, and I chose horsemanship. Basically an entire semester of riding horses 3 days a week. Most people in the class chose the same horse to ride every session, It's just easier when you get used to one. The one I liked most was Remy, a somewhat tall thoroughbred gelding. This is important later. So about a month into the class, once everyone is comfortable with the basics, it's time to learn the emergency dismount. It's how to safely bail when the horse goes bonkers and staying on would be a bad idea. The procedure is pretty simple. Lean forward, brace your weight on your hands on the saddle pommel, that lump in front that the horn sticks out of. Drop your stirrups, swing your right leg back and over, then slide down the side of the horse. The instructor demonstrated, then had us try it in groups of 3 to 4 at a trot. I went in the second group, while everyone was still interested in paying attention. Yay me. So most of the class was women, and most of them already had some experience with horses and were fairly thin and average height. They had no trouble lifting themselves up on their hands to make the leg swing easier. Me, well, I'm 5 feet 1 inch, and while I was in pretty great shape at the time, I was also a little thick. So my T-Rex length arms coupled with my size 10s meant lifting myself wasn't going to happen. No big deal, I just needed to lean a little farther forward to get my leg over. Did I mention I'm pretty chesty? So I lean forward, and the saddle horn hits my breastbone just beneath my bra. I drop my stirrups, bring my leg up and twist to swing it over, which causes my shirt to twist around the horn, but I'm not yet aware of that. I get my leg over and start my downward slide, at which point I realize my shirt is twisted around the horn because it's preventing me from pushing myself clear of the horse. And to make things even worse, the horn hooks under my bra. Remember where I said the horse was tall and I'm very not? There was no stopping my downward slide once I'd started, but my shirt and bra were not coming with me. The horse, bless his patient heart, figured out things were bad and stopped immediately, so I wasn't dragged, but I was completely helpless at that point. My shirt and bra were stretched so tightly around me and the saddle horn that I couldn't free them, nor could I move away from the horse enough to get a foot in the stirrup and lift myself up to loosen my clothes. I was trapped, plastered against the side of the horse with my arms pulled in tight to shield my assets from the rest of the class. The instructor, male, ran over and tried to free my shirt, but it was all just stretched too tight. The next best idea would have been to loosen the saddle, but the knot in the girth strap was nestled right between my nipples, so. Eventually, there was no other choice. He made a cradle with his hands and gave me enough of a leg up so I could free myself, which required using my own arms and bearing my chest basically right in his face. With the whole class watching, I got my clothes free, put everything back where it belonged, remounted the horse, and continued the lesson red-faced. And that's the story of how I flashed 26 people and 23 horses my freshman year of college. Story 11. I was 19 at the time and went to a beer fest with my brother and his 2 friends, let's call them Alan and Joe. Alan worked as a liquor rep and got us free entry. So at this fest, everyone gets a plastic cup with some boxes on it. If you want a beer, it's 2 boxes checked. If you want a mixed drink, it's 4 boxes checked. This was done to prevent people driving drunk. However, many of the liquor reps/salesmen were given stacks and stacks of cups. So my brother took a liking to the bartender that was serving liquor for Alan's brand, and me being a timid 19-year-old didn't want to explore too much in a place I shouldn't have been in, decided to stick with them. We helped her bartend all night, mixing drinks for people and for ourselves, of course. All the meanwhile, Alan and Joe are getting super drunk and trying to take home these 2 girls there. So the fest ends and my brother and I are sober at this point, and we decide it's time to go. Remember those cups? Well, Alan had a box of them and was drinking all he wanted and letting Joe do the same. They're piss drunk and so are these 2 girls they insist on taking with us in the car. So my brother and I have to round up these 4 incoherent people to get them into the car. Well, Alan decided to squat outside the car and take a dump. It gets on the car and I get it on me. I'm upset and irritated with their drunken behavior, but we push on. My brother is driving because he's the most sober and is desperately trying to get us home and get Joe and Alan to ditch these girls. Well, the girls blurts out, "Oh no, we're late for dinner. We have to go now." And the 4 drunk people strong-arm my brother into taking them to this restaurant, a very fancy restaurant. What we didn't know was that it was one of these girls' birthday, and we were 4 unexpected guests. We're not only underdressed for this restaurant, but we have 2 boorish drunk men still trying to get into these ladies' pants. My brother and I are making painfully awkward small talk with these people who know nothing about us or why we are here. We have to recount the whole story for them, and by now we are getting borderline kicked out of the restaurant. Alan is yelling at the waiter to get him another Bud Light, specifically in his flamingo koozie. The waiter is politely refusing to serve him, and he gets yelled at. By now the two girls from the fest are sobering up. Alan and Joe go to the bathroom, and the birthday girl asks me who those two guys are, and why they are here, and why are they such assholes. She then sobs and cries in front of all her birthday guests. My brother and I notice Alan and Joe are in the bathroom a long time and decide now is the time to leave. We walk into the bathroom to collect our drunken idiots, and the bathroom is literally covered, every square inch, in paper towels. You couldn't see the floors or the walls. How they managed that in their state is beyond us. We drag them out and make our way to the car, which for some reason was parked at a car dealership's parking lot. We get 30 feet from the car and alarms start blaring along with a recorded message of "You were trespassing and the police have been called." We scramble to get in the car and drive home. It was incredibly frustrating at the time to deal with all of that, but it's one of the more strange and funny experiences I've had. Story 12. Happened to me when I was young, maybe 10 to 11 years old. Me and my family, mom, dad, aunt, and cousin, if I remember correctly, went to a very remote beachside community in the northeast coast of Brazil called Natal. Now, this is a tourist spot to some degree, but it is mostly extremely poor fishing communities with little access to education. I remember there being an aquarium in one of these villages that was like the main attraction. I saw some animals there I've never seen again, like this frog-like thing with gills, a large spiky tail, and a single horn. I shit you not. If anyone knows what this thing is, please tell me. They had an anaconda display that was empty because the aquarium's neighbor had to kill the poor thing after it escaped more than 8 times into his yard. I say all of this to paint a picture of how remote this place was. No roads mostly, just 1 or 2 here and there, and we mostly got around by dune buggy. Anyway, one day we hire a guide as part of a small group to take us snorkeling at this lake inside a cave. It's a local attraction of sorts, we were told, because the cave is gigantic, as is the lake. And I really mean gigantic. The cave was as tall as a cathedral, and you couldn't see the far end. It just turned to inky darkness. You could see inside the cave at all because the opening was very large, and certain parts of the wall had caved in, making a sort of natural window. The inside of the cave was mostly a giant lake, big enough to have islands if that helps paint the picture better, and big enough that you couldn't see the far end as it went into the cave. The water was crystal clear, and I mean that. If it wasn't for the ripples, you'd almost think there was no water, just a large fall to the ground. It must have been over 100 feet deep at its shallowest point. There was no gradual decline. It was more like an enormous pit filled with water. I can't imagine how deep it got further in the cave. Now, as a kid, I was already imagining all sorts of things that could live in that cave. I mean, as a Brazilian growing up traveling around certain parts of the country, I knew anacondas liked to swim and liked caves. So I was kind of freaked out, but we were in a group, and I didn't want to be the scaredy cat, so I went in the water. As we're swimming, I became distinctly aware of how you really can't see the far end of the lake at all as it melts into the darkness of the cave. And from that darkness, at irregular intervals, the weirdest groan/shriek you've ever heard would rise up. I tell myself it must have been waves, and cave groans and wind and things like that. But that's what I tell myself. That shit didn't sound right, but it damn well sounded like it was alive. And it terrified me, but at this point we were already pretty far from the shore, and I wasn't about to swim back alone. So we keep swimming. Since the water is crystal clear, you can see all the way to the floor, 100 plus FT below. It's pretty amazing actually, until I realized that the floor was not in fact covered in interesting white stones. It was covered in bones. Hundreds, thousands of them. I could make out bull skulls, and sheep carcasses and things like that. And of course I couldn't tell because of how many there were, but I'm sure I saw some human-looking skulls in there. It was almost impossible to tell though, because of the sheer quantity of bones that literally covered the entire floor as far as I could see. And they were all perfectly white, no meat or debris that I could see. At this point, I essentially started panicking. I just felt the whole scenario was really wrong. Now my mom doesn't like talking about this much, which I find weird, but I'm pretty sure she was really freaked out too, 'cause she grabbed my hand and tugged at the guide and motioned for us to turn back. He didn't question it, just turned around and we swam back. It was the longest, slowest, most terrifying swim of my life. I was shaking when we got out. I tried to act cool, but my mom could tell I was shaken to my core. And I was, in fact. To this day, I have an utter fascination for water monsters and creatures, but also a pretty severe phobia of dark, deep water called the saliphobia, which is common, but I really feel it. Doesn't even need to be dark. Deep already does it if I can't see the entirety of the body of water clearly to confirm nothing is in it. I'm not saying I believe in water monsters like Nessie or things like that. All I know is that I don't know what the hell was in that cave, if anything, or what's in the water, and while part of me would like to know, I'm sure as hell never going anywhere near that place or any deep, dark body of water ever again. Story 13. Last summer, I was spending a couple of weeks on my grandpa's childhood farm in North Dakota. It was honestly the best and worst 2 weeks of my life. For one, I ended up slipping on a rock and falling into the river on the third day while fishing, ruining my phone and temporary fishing license. I was also really cold. I also crashed my dirt bike and came home severely bruised and unable to move properly for a week. But the craziest thing that happened a week into the trip. Before I continue, my great-uncle and his wife used to live in the old farmhouse, but the old farmhouse had mold problems and had never been renovated since it was built in the early 1950s. So they built a manufactured home about 30 yards away from the farmhouse, and for the past 5 years, my grandpa and his siblings have been working on renovating the farmhouse themselves. The farmhouse is small, 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom upstairs, with a small kitchen and living room. It has a garage connected, as well as a basement, which used to have rooms, but had to be gutted due to the mold. The house is very important to my family, and so far the renovations have been great. There is no more mold. The bathroom is completely remodeled and modern. All of the walls upstairs are repainted, and the family spent a lot of money putting in new furniture. For this summer trip, as much as I didn't want to, I was put in the manufactured home, while my grandparents and my little brother were given a room in the old farmhouse. I didn't want to be in the manufactured home because it was storm season, and for anyone who hasn't been in western North Dakota during the peak summer storm season, those storms get really gnarly. And there was no way in hell I was staying in a manufactured trailer home during those storms. I still had my laptop and iPad, and my great-aunt watched the news every morning, so I was very aware of the weather. So when the weatherman predicted very severe storms for us one night, I didn't hesitate to move my stuff to the old farmhouse and sleep on the living room couch. I planned on sleeping anyway. My grandpa tried telling me that the news just sensationalized stuff, and I would be just fine in the trailer house with my great-aunt and third cousin, who was also staying there. But I refused. Call me a pussy, but I could just feel it in the air. It was hot and muggy that day, and I just knew something big was coming, whether or not the news said it. My grandpa just shrugged, and at around 10 p.m., went to bed with my little brother. I sat at the living room table on my laptop, playing World of Warcraft and listening to some hunting podcast on YouTube, with the window behind me open to let in some cold night air. The farmhouse didn't have AC except for this little window unit in the kitchen, which was pretty terrible at its job, but whatever. I could still feel it. I lost track of time, but all of a sudden, a massive gust of wind hit the house, and the curtain slapped me really hard on the back of my head. I was so startled that I jumped up and smashed my knees below the table, before spinning around to slam the window shut. I heard my grandpa get up to close the windows in the kitchen and make sure the window AC unit was secure, which it wasn't, so my grandpa took it out. About 30 seconds after the wind gust hit, the power went out. I live right up against the foothills in Colorado and have otherwise lived on the plains my whole life, yet I've never heard or seen such a powerful wind. The lightning was also ridiculously frequent too, so I didn't even need a flashlight to see. I knew the internet was knocked out, so my grandpa let me tether my iPad and laptop to his phone's 4G, so I could still keep track. My grandpa and I stood in the kitchen for a good 10 minutes, just memorized by the storm. My grandpa spent his first 22 years of his life on his farm and came back frequently when he moved, and he said he never saw a storm nearly that powerful before. With each lightning strike, we could see that most of the trees on the farm were bent at 90-degree angles at least, and the grass was just flattened by the wind. My grandpa reasoned that if the storm got any worse, we would go to the basement, but otherwise we'd be okay. Later on, I found out my grandpa wanted to go to the basement, But my little brother is very sensitive to emotions, and we didn't want to freak him out. So my grandpa returned to his bedroom to lay down with my brother, while I returned to my laptop in the living room. For the next 4 hours, all I could hear was what sounded like a jet engine roaring around the house. The wind drove the rain sideways, and even straight up just below the roof. I saw the rain circling below the lip of the roof of one of our sheds in the lightning when I looked outside. I also noticed our trees by the road didn't look nearly as full as I remembered them. I tried to distance myself away from the window and just try to ignore the storm. We didn't get any warnings for a long time, which I found strange. However, I did find a website that connects to all of these little individual weather stations in my local area. I clicked on one that must have been on top of the Garrison Dam, which had a wind gust clocked in at about 115 miles per hour. I think I just went numb at that point. The dam was less than 10 minutes away from us, so if it was getting gusts like that, chances are we were too. After 4 hours of what I can only describe as feeling like I was in some fucking horror movie, the storm slowly subsided. I was so tired, though, that at about 3:30 a.m., a half hour before the storm finally began to calm down, I decided to lay down. I put my laptop down on the coffee table and went over to a little side table in a corner by the TV, where I had my motocross helmet. I took my dirt bike with me to the farm and was riding it around. I remembered my dad told me a story about surviving a tornado with his motocross helmet on when he was a kid, and decided that if shit really hit the fan, I would be prepared. I fell asleep on the couch in my motocross helmet and cowboy boots just in case we had to go to the basement, with a live radar on my laptop on the coffee table, and woke up when the lights and fan turned back on. By then, it was 4:30 a.m. I could still hear some wind and rain outside, but it didn't sound nearly as terrifying as before, so I just turned off the lamp, closed my laptop, and went to sleep. My grandpa woke me up at about 9 a.m. the next morning and told me everyone was okay, and breakfast was waiting for me in the trailer. I groggily got up, took my helmet off, and stumbled next door. There wasn't nearly as much damage as I was expecting, though a few of our lawn chairs were missing and plenty of tree limbs were downed. My great-aunt said it was one hell of a scary night for her and my third cousin, but they were okay. However, my great-aunt's daughter called crying to tell us that a friend of hers was killed by the storm when his camper blew over on top of him at the lake. That ended up in the news. Also, we found out that a farmhouse less than 5 miles away from us literally got blown apart by the storm. The only reason why the family survived is because the father had a shotgun, which he used to shoot the basement door to equalize the pressure and get his family to safety. That story in particular really haunts me because if the roof would have been torn off our farmhouse, we had nothing to break down our solid wood basement door, which would have been impossible to open considering the pressure differences. The storm we were hit by also spawned massive tornadoes in Montana and South Dakota. I'm pretty sure our roof was a wind gust away from being torn off our house, and I'm extremely thankful to God that we were all safe and alive in the end. My grandpa doesn't doubt me or the news anymore. Story 14. So when I was in my final year of high school, my relationship with my ex was disintegrating. He was emotionally abusive, and I was starting to see through the lies and everything he would do to manipulate me. Well, a mutual friend of ours was going through a though time in dealing with some shit and being the caring person I am. I was there for support and talked to them, and we became closer, and they started tutoring me in chemistry, which I was struggling with, and we spent time together after school because of this. My ex had a massive issue with this because said friend happened to have a dick. This was despite most of our friend group being guys and him having no issues with any of them, including a close friend of mine. Later found out it was because he never saw any of them as a threat. So I told him about the first friend's issues, minimal info with friends' consent. I'm not one to tell personal shit that's not wanted to be told. Well, my ex didn't like this and said he should go to someone else for help. I didn't like this, and didn't like him telling me who I can and can't be friends with, and I also understood what this guy was going through due to my own mental health problems, and was more than happy to help and provide support. Well, my ex never believed in mental health and was convinced that this guy was doing it for attention, and that's all mental health problems are. This view came directly from his mom. So this issue goes on in my ex, and I grow further and further apart, and I begin to think about dumping him. Then he starts getting health issues and tells me he's falling asleep randomly and feeling unwell and is getting tests. He then says it may be cancer. So I put plans on hold to dump him because I don't want to be the asshole who dumps the guy who's getting tested for cancer, and am still not 100% sure of dumping him because I still love him a bit, and am still not aware fully of the emotional abuse. Then he tells me I can't talk about the cancer with his family while his grandma is visiting from NZ because she doesn't know, and he wants to ignore it until he has proper results. This rings some alarm bells, but I agree and worry with him still and wait for results. He acts like it's cancer for a little bit, but the relationship breaks down more and I grow closer to the friend I'm supporting and fall for him, and we end up kissing, which makes me feel insanely guilty. A couple of weeks later, we are still dating, and I go to my ex's house, and I haven't told him yet, but it's eating me alive, but I wanted to make a choice before telling him as I'm torn between the guys. While I'm there, I realize I have no feelings, tell him everything, and we end up breaking up. Well, everything ends up coming out over the next couple of weeks, and find out the narcolepsy was him faking it, even him passing out while I'm at his place to make it more real. The cancer was bullshit because he wanted the attention I was giving the friend, and he sees no difference between faking cancer and mental illness, which he thinks is fake in general. This is when the real manipulation begins. He then tells me he's depressed since the breakup and tried to keep me his friend by saying he'll kill himself and blame me directly in his suicide note if I don't stay friends with him. This is after him telling me mental illness is something faked for attention and him telling me directly not to get help when I think I need it. I try my best to get him help but can't cope, and he refuses to talk to anyone else. This goes on for a couple of months, and I start dating the friend during this time after a break between them. This all comes to a head one day when I have a practice exam because it's my final year at school and exams are coming up, and when I get out of it I have a few missed calls and messages from my ex saying he's gonna kill himself, and the final text says he swallowed a bottle of pills and was sent half an hour ago. Cue me panicking and calling his mom and sister and sending his sister a message saying what he's told me with no answers. I'm in tears, and my now BF and his friend take me to one of our teacher's offices as I'm shaking and sobbing, and we tell her what he sent and showed her the messages, and she calls his home. His mom answers, checks on him, and he's in his room fine, playing WoW like nothing happened. I am beyond pissed knowing he couldn't have taken as many pills as he had and be fine. He messages me saying he changed his mind just after taking them and made himself throw them all up, which I know is BS, and he claimed he didn't tell anyone when he did it because he didn't want to worry him. So his family think I'm crazy after that, and the teacher is a bit suspicious, and I break down and tell her everything. I know I should have gone to someone sooner, but he said he would kill himself if I did, and I didn't want to risk that. The teacher calms me down, tells me to go through our message history and bring her everything to school on Monday. It's Friday, and we will work it out, and says if he tries to message me again to let her know. So I ignore him all weekend, and on Monday go with printouts of the messages and sort it out, and he ends up leaving me alone after this. I also start to find out he was spreading lies about me to people at school, saying I'd been sleeping with his best friend behind his back. The friend and I had only kissed once before I broke up with my ex, and they were barely friends, so everyone thought he meant someone else. After months of damage from him, including nightly panic attacks from the constant threat of him committing suicide, I start to heal and soon enough finish high school, and haven't seen him really since, other than a mutual friend's engagement party where I ignored him. Also, this does have a happy ending as the friend I kissed, and I have been together now for almost 5 years and got engaged recently. He's an amazing guy and all I ever wanted, and it was worth going through this hell to get him. It showed us who our real friends were too, because a lot of fake ones left me for the ex despite me telling some of them what he had done. Story 15. When me and my slightly older cousins were kids, they'd try to convince me of falsehoods all the time. I was, and still kind of am, extremely gullible. I fell for, hey, gullible is on the ceiling more than once. One day when I was around 11, the elder of my cousins was talking about how he was joining a lacrosse team. I had no idea what that was, so I asked him. He explained the rules and the tools of the game. I was certain that he was lying to me, that it was another prank. There was no f***ing way people ran around with small baskets on sticks, throwing and catching hard balls. That's insanity. So I smirked, said sure, and went on my way. For the next several years, whenever someone mentioned lacrosse, I'd snicker, thinking I was privy to a joke. When I was around 17, a friend of mine mentioned that she was going to a lacrosse game. I laughed and said, kind of annoyed, yeah, I know the joke. You can drop it. Lacrosse isn't real. She was so confused and looked at me like I was crazy. She insisted it was in fact real. I insisted it wasn't. We looked it up online. Sure enough, completely real. I was utterly shocked, and way more than a little embarrassed, especially when I thought back to all of my weird responses to mentions of lacrosse. Story 16. I was an emancipated minor who had lived on my own since just before I was 16. My parents had kicked me out because I refused to follow their belief system. I consider them to be religious fanatics. Among other issues, I was told at 15 that I was not allowed to have my own money, that anything I earned would need to be turned over to them. Luckily, I had understanding bosses who made sure my pay ended up where it belonged. My favorite manager's last act before leaving town was to ask his landlord to let me move in and told him to keep the deposit he'd put down in place of me having to make one. A few months into junior year, I met a guy who I thought I wanted to be with forever, who I thought also wanted to be with me. I'll call him T for troll. T told me all the things any young girl wants to hear. You're beautiful. You're perfect. I never want to be apart. I don't want to be without you. I miss you. I love you. As it turns out, he was just after sex. He drove me out to the edge of town because he was always worried about being seen with me. See, I was T's secret girlfriend, who he was cheating on his other girlfriend, S, with. T dumped me immediately after and wouldn't even give me a ride home. He told me that I was a slut and that he made all those promises and said all those things just to get in my pants. He didn't even drive me home, just left me to walk 2 miles home in the dark. Right before he drove away, he threw the condom at me. I didn't realize it until much, much later, but it had nothing inside. He'd taken it off somehow without me noticing. A week and a half later, I started to feel funny, like something was off, like when you're starting to get sick, but you're not showing symptoms. I waited for my period and it didn't show up, and I've been as regular as the tide since my first. So I peed on a stick and waited anxiously in the bathroom for it to say negative. It wasn't. So I scheduled an appointment with the doctor's office, counting on privacy laws to cover me from any family or anyone else finding out. I tried to call him, tried to corner him in the hall a couple times and just said, "I really important need to talk to you. And very nearly shouted it at him, but was too afraid of the consequences. Between the rumors of violence from an ex-girlfriend and his very real temper, I didn't want to end up a statistic. I also didn't want to have to deal with my parents' religious stuff and teachers being nosy and unhelpful. I made the choice quickly that I was going to hide it, and not long after that, I made the decision that I should give the baby for adoption. Fast forward to my 8-week checkup. They did an ultrasound because something seemed off, and the doctor was being extra careful. The technician looked at my chart a couple times and back at the screen, then said, "I'll be right back," and went to get Doc. Doc tells me there's 2 babies. I remain fairly expressionless. They console me thinking that I'm shocked, which I really wasn't that shocked. Twins run in my family. I knew at that point that I was not going to change my mind from the path I'd set for myself. I continued to hide it for the first 4 months, making arrangements so I could leave town for a few months. I found someone to take over the rent for the summer and quit my jobs. Summer break hit, and I left town, headed out to a friend's place a few states away. That didn't work out. My friend had no intention of letting me stay, so I had to find a place to stay and figure out some other things. I'd planned to stay till after the birth, but I had a late miscarriage the week after I arrived. It absolutely wrecked me. I'd been mentally prepared to give them to their parents. I'd chosen the couple and we'd talked about how we wanted things to go. I was ready for the end of my pregnancy to be childbirth. Instead, it was a whole different process and I was in the hospital with some complications. I spent the next few weeks pulling myself back together as best I could. When I got back to town, everyone said I looked sick, like hell, etc. I told everyone that I didn't sleep much and played video games instead. As far as I know, no one that was in my life at that time had any idea. I went back to work and school, finished high school, and moved on with life. I'm in therapy for a lot of issues, but this is one of them. I literally was alone through all of it. Story 17. I was stationed in Korea, and my squad mates and I used to love just wandering around the cities aimlessly finding whatever we could. We once found a claw machine game in a skeevy back alley that had all kinds of adult toys like vibrators, cheap novelty panties, etc. While we were standing there laughing, an elderly woman started looking at them with us and said, "Which one? I can get." I pointed to a box with a pair of tittish stress balls and put some money in, and she got it first try. Claw machines in Korea are actually winnable, but they still take skill. Another time, we wound up in an open-air market and found a young guy to show us around after we gave him a bottle of soju. He only knew basic English, but he was telling us about what everything was and which vendors were the best. We came to a stall with a bunch of weird cuts of meat, and there was a display in the middle with what looked like a bunch of huge penises. We later found out that they were beef penis. We asked our new friend what they were, and he said, "Don't know, but it looked like big dicks." A few nights later, we ended up in a really cool arcade where we got our asses absolutely handed to us by a bunch of 10-year-old kids in Tekken. When we happened to win a round after a dozen tries, we high-fived each other and yelled, "America." After that, every time we got beat by the kids, they all joined us in yelling Korea. We used the skills we learned from the aforementioned old woman to win a buttload of candy from a claw machine and shared it with the Korean kids, who showed us how to do some awesome Tekken combo moves. But my favorite experience was when we were all half drunk, and by that I mean completely trashed, and wandering around back alleys. We were trying to find a donut shop, but we got totally lost and couldn't recognize anything around us. We were about to throw in the towel and flag down a cab when a young guy came out of the shadows, looked us over, and then motioned for us to follow him. The dude didn't speak a single word of English, so we had no idea where he was taking us. He led us through a bunch of narrow streets, each one darker than the last, until we were in a pitch-black alley with a dark staircase. He motioned again to follow, and walked down the stairs towards a faint, blue light a couple of stories down. We were reluctant to follow because this is how horror movies start, but we were young and dumb and thought, we're a squad of soldiers. We can handle whatever is waiting for us down there. So we went down the stairs and walked through the steel door under the blue light. Inside, we realized that we were in a literal underground club with a full bar and a live DJ. When we stepped inside, it was like the whole room stopped and stared at us. The young guy we were following said a few words to the guys in the club, and then motioned for us to go to the bar. When we ordered a few drinks and didn't act like idiot Americans, everyone relaxed a bit and started to act like normal. We hit the dance floor, and a group of college-aged people taught us how to do a dance they called the Korean shuffle. In return, we offered to buy the next round of drinks, and they convinced us to order something called the God Panther. The description on the menu was Korean, so we had no idea what was in it, but it glowed bright green under the UV lights and was damn tasty. After that, we got some shots of tequila and taught them how to play quarters. We all blacked out at some point and miraculously woke up in our barracks rooms the next morning. We told the rest of the platoon about this awesome place we found, and we spent the next few nights trying to find it again, but we never found anything that looked remotely familiar from that night. Most people thought we were making it up. But for the soldiers in 3rd Squad, it was a memory that we'll always treasure. I was stationed in Korea, and my squad mates and I used to love just wandering around the cities aimlessly finding whatever we could. Story 18. For a short period of time, my job brought me to Japan. Me and a friend of mine was feeling adventurous, and we were always on the lookout for anything to make the most of our time there. A few times what we came up was to drink our livers to death. So when he told me that he found a group that's wanting to climb a mountain, I was more than excited. Something healthy and wholesome, I thought. Before the climb, there was a pre-climb meetup. It was a week prior to the climb. During the meetup, I was, not surprisingly, hungover again. I think the buy me drinky bars had become a go-to place for us at that time, haha. Anyways, I dragged myself to this meeting place and laid my head on one of the bench table and tried to listen. Unfortunately, the remaining alcohol in my system blocked majority of the important stuff out. I could recall a piece of the speech about a bus to get there and needing a good stick and a good night's rest prior to the climb. Well, since this thing is on a weekend and the night prior to that is a Friday, the way we are going, we will probably show up at this thing hungover again. I hope not, I thought. It's Friday after work and my buddy and I are usually at this where do we go type of mood to let steam off from the week's work. I told him I found this place where they serve some good chicken and some booze, lol. 1 beer became 2. 2 became 8. Next thing we know, it's 11 p.m., and we need to be up at 5 a.m. the next day to hop on the bus. We are both laughing it off and talking about it, but in reality, we both know we were about to be in a world of hurt if we don't get our asses home and get some rest. So I head home and only got about 3 hours of sleep in. We hop on this bus, and I was knocked out. I have no idea if my buddy slept as he was sitting behind me, but my guess is he probably did. Luckily, the trip to get there was 3 hours long. I got some of those triangle rice meals that they get from 7-Eleven they call onigiri. These were really good. So it must have helped sober me up a bit. Waking up to this thing was really awesome. Despite the fact that our dumbass didn't prepare well enough, I felt great. Nice warm breeze. The atmosphere around was encouraging. It almost felt like as if I got a whole night's rest before this. There's a store up front. I got more onigiri, and they sell a cool-looking walking stick. Just like the group leaders said. Even though we signed up with the group, we didn't really climb up together. Another guy joins up with us, so there's the 3 of us walking together. As we walked further along, sometimes stopping briefly to take pictures, I asked my buddy how long to get to the top. He said he's not sure. He actually skipped that meetup that I attended. So we both went up to the guy that joined with us. Asked him how long to get to the summit. He said, 6 hours. Me and my buddy looked at each other in horror as I trail back to the series of events that lead to this. See, when my drunk ass attended the meetup, what I neglected to pay attention to was the fact that we were about to climb Mt. Fuji, and what the experienced climber was yammering about up front was probably to tell us that this wasn't a simple climb to do. This was made clear to us by the guy we were now walking with. Thus the beginning of the most brutal day I spent in Japan. Actually, it wasn't so bad on the way up. The amount of sleep that I got in the bus fueled me for a bit. The variety of people that you end up hiking past was also pretty interesting. Towards the beginning of the climb, there were porta potties. Although I cannot remember any after that, considering you'll be walking up for 5 to 6 hours. About 2 to 3 hours in, there were huge sections where we are by ourselves, mostly just a few people here and there. Another interesting thing we came across were these tiny huts. What you're supposed to do is show them that stick that you bought at the foot of the mountain, give them a few yen, and they will stamp your stick. I'm guessing it's kind of a proof of your accomplishment that you got that far. Surprisingly, neither me nor my buddy have puked the entire time. What's surprising was the guy that we were walking with. About 4 hours into this thing, started feeling sick. I am guessing because of the air. He told us he is not going to be able to finish it. We tried to encourage him, but to no avail. About 5 hours into this thing, and my buddy was wanting to give up as well. I talked him out of quitting. Honestly, I also didn't want to climb the rest of the way by myself was another reason. About 5 to 6 hours close to the summit was absolutely stunning. Not just because of the view, but the sheer amount of people climbing is now suddenly in full view. I'm not sure why, but maybe the path was narrower or everyone is more tired that we are all catching up to each other, but it was breathtaking. But not as breathtaking as when you get to the top, though. It was a bed of clouds. We sat on a piece of log. I was enjoying the view and fighting the urge to lay down like a brick and passing out. Also, surprisingly, there's a store there. I don't even want to imagine how they get supplies up there. Now for the finale. The climb down was supposed to take about the same amount of time. Except you're 5x more exhausted and there isn't much view to see. To add more to our injury, the ground isn't anything sturdy. It is sandy and your foot digs down into it at each step. If you are not wearing pants and are wearing shoes with low cut, which most of us are, you'll have rocks falling inside and you'll have to take your shoes off every 30 minutes to get them out. It was hell on earth, and calling the Japanese Coast Guard or rescue crossed my mind. We did make it down in time before dark. Ultimately, I don't regret doing the climb of a lifetime. I don't know where my buddy is nowadays. I stopped talking to him a long time ago, but I do have the climbing stick with me till today. Story 20. My parents had this old coffee maker, made in the 70s. They used it until the year I was born, 1990. It was one of the first models which could automatically brew coffee at a set time. And the coffee was very good, and importantly, very hot. The year I was born, the coffee maker stopped working. They shrugged and bought a new one. But that same year, they also bought a little cottage on a lake as a summer house. Lo and behold, there in the kitchen was the very same model of coffee maker. They still have the cottage, and the coffee maker works to this day. Around 2 years ago, pondering all of the above, I wondered whether I could find that coffee maker on the internet. I did a quick Google search, and there it was. First result, eBay. I didn't even bother to click the link. It was just a mild curiosity, after all. I already had a coffee maker. But it was nice to know I could pretty easily find it online. Over the course of the last 2 years, periodically I'd visit my folks at the cottage, and I'd drink the coffee, and I'd do another quick Google search. And each time, there it was. First result. eBay. Nice to know. A few months ago, my girlfriend of 3 years left. I hadn't realized how many of the things in our apartment were hers. The place was quite empty. Such a lonely feeling. Anyway, one of the things she took, because it technically belonged to her, was our coffee maker. Well, I wasn't about to go without my morning coffee. I began researching the latest models, intending to pick one up at the store that day. But then that old 70s model floated back into my brain. I did a quick search. There it was. First result, eBay. Perhaps for the first time, I'm not really sure. I clicked the link. I examined. Looks good. Decent price. Reputable seller. Then I decided to look around to see if any other were available. Maybe compare prices. But I couldn't find any other. At least, not in that moment. I didn't dig really deep. I wanted a coffee maker, and I wanted one now. But for that sweet 70s relic, I was willing to wait a few days for USPS. I ordered the eBay unit, and it has since arrived, and I am thrilled. It's in fantastic condition, works like a charm, and the coffee is just as good, if not better, than at my folks' cottage. It has helped fill the void that my loved one left behind. A small symbol of my first steps toward moving on. I'm so happy with it, in fact, that I've decided to buy a backup. You know, in case anything should ever happen to it, or in case I wear it out. But I can't find another one. I've dug deep this time. I've found some that are similar, but not the same. I found pieces of the correct one, but not another full set. I've come to believe I was seeing the very same listing on eBay every time I searched over the last couple of years. Story 19. Back during my senior year of college, I attended a house party. I was drinking and getting pretty buzzed, standing around in a group talking to some people. I turn and look down the hall and see a friend. I'll call her R. I turn to her and jovially call out her name. She smiles at me, then proceeds to stick her razor-sharp fingernail up my right nostril and cuts the skin, causing my nose to bleed. She then turns and walks into the kitchen. I stood there dumbfounded for a second, slipping my own index finger into my nose and seeing it just caked in my blood. I turned to my good friend, I'll call him Jay, and say, "Yo," or just shoved her finger up my nose and gave me a nosebleed. Jay, who was drunk, says, "You should totally call her out on that." Not really sure where that would take me, I drunkenly agree with him and follow her into the kitchen. Now the kitchen was packed with people. It was a small kitchen, so there was little leg room. I spot her over at the fridge, most likely getting a drink. So I corner her. The kitchen table to our left, the wall to our right. There was nowhere she could go. She turns to face me, and I hold up my bloody finger. "Look what you did, R." I say. "What are you talking about?" She responds, "You cut my nose and made me bleed." "Okay, that's gross. Can you stop that?" I didn't realize that I was sucking the blood off my finger and then resicking my finger back up my nose over and over, most likely to keep my nose from bleeding all over me. "I just want an apology. Can you just move, please?" She asks. "No, I want an apology." I demanded. "Seriously, if you don't move, I'm going to punch you." Now some girl from the other side of the kitchen was watching this whole thing, in which it looks like I'm probably harassing R. She chimes in. "Are you going to punch him? If you say you're going to punch him, then you better punch him." She'll come back into the story later. I shrug off what the rando says and continue to ask for my apology. Why it was so important to me at this point, I don't know. I had been drinking. R then turns to this guy next to her who was mixing drinks, a tall bearded man, and asks him if he could get me out of the way. This guy says sure thing. Now I'm expecting him to pick my short ass up and remove me from the situation. Instead, he starts to dance towards me to the party music, wraps his arm around me, and puts his hand between my legs. I freak out and start backing up to get away, feeling his other hand cut my junk. I trip on a random person's leg in the crowded kitchen and fall on the floor. I'm soon picked up by other party goers, and I'm now face to face with that girl from before. I see my drunk friend Jay standing in the kitchen doorway. Dancing guy is gone, and R is watching as well. This girl asks what I was doing on the floor. I ask her if she was going to punch me. She says it depends. What was I doing on the floor? I say that gay guy was trying to grab my junk. She then gets the biggest shocked expression and shouts, "That's my boyfriend, you asshole." She then socks me hard in my right cheek. I was just bewildered by the turn of events that night. I just looked back at this chick who stood there looking at me. I don't know what was going through her head. Was she surprised I didn't fall down? Was she expecting me to hit her back? All eyes from the party are on me. I just shout out to the kitchen ceiling. This is all our fault. My friend Jay then turns to R and says, "Oh who?" pointing her out to the crowd. Everyone in the kitchen then joins in on the shaming to her. She shrugs and leaves the kitchen. Two guys come along and pull face punch her away. She smiled devilishly. So to recap, within the span of 5 minutes, I got the inside of my nose cut, groped by a man, and then punched in the face. R apologized to me the next day. Turns out the boyfriend-girlfriend duo. Yeah, he just grabs guys' junks for the F of it, and she was infamous for punching people at parties. Lovely couple. Story 21. This is a story from a through hike I went on this past summer. I was over 3 weeks into a month-long hike, and I was starting to have major motivation problems. It was a rainy day, and I decided, fuck it, I'm not going to wear any rain gear because you just get hot in addition to being soaked. I climbed to the top of a lookout point and met a man with his 2 teenage children. He's super funny and nice, and we hit it off and chat for a bit. He asks me about what I'm eating and how my hike is going. After weeks of being mostly solo most of the time, it's so good to talk with a good conversation partner. But it's storming, and we're high up, so we shortly part ways. Anyways, the next day of my hike is brutal. My gear is still damp, and my body was not holding up as well as I hoped. I'm fatigued to my core, and I want to be done. But I'm determined to go 15 miles anyways, one of my longer days. Mile 11 to 13 are a beach walk portion. I thought, great, that'll be fun. Absolutely not. Walking through tiny beach rocks and hiking boots with a 40-pound back is hard. I dumped a full cup of rocks out of my shoes afterwards. I get to the end of the walk, and there's a little bridge leading back towards the woods. On the bridge, there's a sign that says lowest elevation point of the SHT being the trail. And I'm thinking to myself, I get it. Today is the worst day. God damn it. You really know how to kick someone when they're already down. So I keep going, and I make it to a road crossing with trail signs on either side. And on the near sign, I see a gas station bag full of goodies. In my head, I'm thinking simultaneously, no way, and then it has to be for me. I get up close to it, and in permanent marker, all caps, it says my very uncommon first name. I was speechless. Inside there was a full-sized bag of kettle chips, a 24-ounce Coke, an apple, and an orange. The kindly man I spoke to asked me what food I missed most and how far I was going. I said potato chips and 15 miles. He delivered. Best day on the trail. I don't usually drink pop, but that Coke, still a little cold, was maybe the best thing I ever tasted. Story 22. I work at a movie theater concession. This is the story about my best shift so far. It was opening night for Spider-Man, Far From Home, which also happened to be on a Tuesday cheap ticket night. We also had plenty of show times for Avengers, in-game, so we knew it was going to be nuts. We popped extra popcorn, stocked up cups and candy, had extra staff scheduled, and even the managers were ready to come help us. And I was on the main till that guests line up too. An hour into my shift, the rush begins. Lineups all the way to the door, everyone's rushing to fill orders, and I'm working my ass off with the biggest lineup. There's popcorn all over the floor, and I knew that cleanup afterwards was going to be a pain in the ass. Then something happened that just brightened my day. Just as the rush was dying down, Spider-Man and his girlfriend, not MJ, come up to my till and order. The guy had a full-blown Spider-Man costume for opening night. His girlfriend seemed like she just didn't want to be there, and he was just so hyped for the movie. It was honestly hilarious. I served them their food and drinks and gave him free butter, say I liked his costume, and told them to enjoy the movie. But it gets better. Another guy came in with an Iron Spider costume, the suit from Infinity War, but without the golden claws, came in, but didn't order anything from concession. As I was cleaning up, I saw the guy in the Spider-Man costume go up to the Iron Spider costume, and they were like, You dressed up too? Awesome, man. And they acted like best friends even though they didn't even know each other. Later in the night, a group of guests were leaving the building, and I saw the two guys in costume chatting away like mad about the movie. The guy's girlfriend was just following behind them, and he didn't even acknowledge her. It was hilarious. Story 23. I was pregnant, in high school, and hadn't even told my parents. I was definitely going to fail AP European History. Already hardly passing with a low D, and it was the day of the big final test with everything on it from the whole year. I was so freaking stressed. My absolute god of a teacher, who, to this day, I swear must have had a sixth sense and known I was pregnant, or at least knew I was going through some shit, took me aside during the final, gave me a single blank sheet of paper, and told me, "Number the lines 1 to 10. When I had done that, he told me that this was my final, and all I had to do was name off the different time periods we had learned about that year, X, Renaissance, etc. They didn't even have to be in order, guys. He passed me with a C that I probably didn't deserve, and I will never forget it. Mr. Bonewell, my dude, if you see this, I owe you one. You f***ing rock." Note: I just went and checked to see if he still works there, and he does, and his school email is posted. Is it super creepy if I email him saying thanks for being awesome even though he probably won't remember me? Story 24. When I was like 6 years old, my dad taught me how to grab ants with the tip of my fingers in a way that the ant couldn't bite me and I wouldn't hurt it. I'm talking about those big red leafcutter ants. In my country, we call them bachacos. Now, in my school's playground, there were a lot of these ants. I taught my friends how to grab them with the fingertips technique, and we would spend all our recess time playing with ants. Eventually, as we were evil little curious kids, we found out that if we plucked out their antennas, they wouldn't recognize each other and would fight to death. Knowing this, we would spend our day looking for the best battle ants we could find to make them kill each other for our entertainment. It was only a matter of time until we began making bets. We also started selling each other the best warriors, and more kids joined the business. We didn't know that we were doing something wrong, but we kept it a secret from our teachers only because they wouldn't let us play with insects. The place where we kept our fighters and the bowl we used as our coliseum received the name of Bacacolandia, which translates to something like Antland. One day a kid found a really big ant and sold it to another kid for like 3 times the price of a regular ant. When the big moment came, the big ant turned out to be a really bad fighter and got its head cut off by a normal-size ant. The kid said that he got scammed and wanted his money back, so they started fighting. This got our teacher involved, and she was horrified when she found out what we were doing, and that was the end of Bacacolandia. Story 25. When I was a kid, my family and I would go camping every summer and bring my best friend one along with us. One of our favorite places to go was Yogi Bear Jellystone Park, and we would try to hit up a different location in a nearby state every year. I remember one day he and I were at the pool and there was nobody else there but us and the lifeguard. I actually have this picture my dad took of us swimming before he left to show just how empty it really was. The reason why it was so empty and why my dad left was because the mosquitoes were biting like crazy. Juan and I were having so much fun with the pool to ourselves that we didn't care. There was probably like an hour or two before the pool officially closed, but since we were still there, the lifeguard had to be there too and endure the constant attacks by the mosquitoes. She kept trying to hint at us that we should get going, but when it became clear that we were going nowhere, she resorted to different tactics. She went over to her bag and came back with 2 $5 bills in her hands and said, "If I give you boys $5 each, will you please leave the pool?" Juan and I looked at each other, and although we were having a blast, $5 was a lot of money to us back then since we were like 8 years old. We accepted her bribe and made our way to the arcade/game room to use the money we just made. Looking back, I feel kind of bad for the lifeguard because we didn't even think about how much it sucked for her. But at the same time, it's kind of funny we got paid to just f*** off because she wanted to go home. Story 26. The first time I started playing RuneScape was when I was like 5. I was a smart kid, so I could read and write really well for my age, but typing was hard, so I was able to get by playing games on my own. One day I was somewhere mining with just this one other dude, and he starts sending me messages, and I'm a friendly 5-year-old, so I, very slowly, BC typing, would message him back. After a bit, the questions started getting more and more odd. Started as just simple, "How old are you?" and quickly developed to, "Where do you live? Where do you go to school?" Big red flags like that. But I'm a 5-year-old, and I'm responding to all this stuff in 5-year-old manner. I'm 5, guess. Spends 10 minutes trying to type out my full name, spends 20 minutes trying to type out my mailing address and home phone hashtag. Ultimately, the guy only learned how old I was because I was never able to finish typing any other answers before he would ask me another question. and he wound up leaving. I told my mom about it a while later, thinking nothing of it, and she fipped and banned all of us from playing online games for like 8 years. Story 27. My dad was friends with a crow that lived at his workplace for a few years while we lived in Bosnia, and one day Po, as my dad named him, came up to him and started showing my dad that he couldn't fly properly, like really exaggerating how he couldn't fly. So my dad picked him up and put him in an open box and took him home to me and my mom. Po lived with us for a few days and acted like he's been with people his whole life, even though he was clearly a wild crow. He ate from our hands and would hang out with us on the patio, and he even let me hold him, which was surprising, given I was about 3 at the time. Bosnia doesn't have a lot of air conditioning, so we always had the sliding door to the patio open, so it's not like Po was trapped. After maybe 3 days, he decided he was feeling better and flew off after catching our attention to let us know he was going. My dad never saw him again since we lived around 10 miles away from where my dad worked, and I guess he never made it back. Still, was a very cool experience to have a pet crow for a few days. Story 28. When I was in 12th grade, I was in choir, and one day after rehearsal, we all went to a roller skating rink. Problem was, I didn't know how to skate at all. I was kind of freaked out, so while all my friends were skating, I kind of sat on the sidelines and watched until one of my 11th grade friends came up to me. She told me it wasn't super difficult, and despite my protest, she grabbed my hand and basically pulled me onto the rink with her. At first, it was painfully awkward. My sad 18-year-old self was slowly drifting along holding my friend's hand while 8 to 9-year-old kids whizzed past me. But eventually, she led me to a secluded corner of the rink and taught me how to actually do it. It turned out to be more simple than I thought, and after a lot of hand-holding, tripping, falling, at one point I accidentally knocked down one of my choir directors, and deep convos about life. I actually learned how to roller skate that night. Later, I was driving back home with 2 of my senior friends, and I mentioned how she spent most of her whole night teaching me to skate. One of them joked, "Bruh, you sure she didn't just want to hold your hand?" I thought he was joking, but that girl ended up being my first kiss about 1 year later. So I dunno. Maybe. Story 29. I had a kind of strange coworker who asked me out on a few occasions, but I had politely said no. There came to be a point where I had to make a no contact out of work rule with him, because he kept sending me weird messages and I felt he was following me to lunch. Now in the office, I had a snack drawer, and the topic of my snack drawer came up because another coworker didn't eat lunch, and she was very hungry. I was offering my wares, and when I mentioned that I had fig Newtons, the same strange coworker crashed our conversation and asked if he could have some fig Newtons. I said sure, and he took 3 and left. The next day, I opened my snack drawer, and I found 3 half-eaten fig Newtons in the package. I thought I had gone crazy for a second until I realized what happened. He had defiled my snack drawer. I talked to a few co-workers about what happened because I thought it was weird, and I wanted to make sure none of them were pulling a prank on me. They ended up telling my manager, who called me into his office where I had to explain what happened. The guy was transferred the next week. Story 30. My parents hated snakes, but I really wanted one as a pet. I'd had rats, birds, fish, you name it, but I'd never had a snake. My mom told me time and time again that if I ever even thought about buying a snake, she'd kick me out. Well, I bought a snake. Without saying anything to anyone, I drove 45 minutes away one night to this shady trailer park in the middle of nowhere just to get a snake from this guy off Craigslist. Somehow I wasn't brutally murdered that night, and I hid my new snake shoelace in my closet so my parents wouldn't find out. Well, my mom found out and absolutely lost her shit. She told me that if Shoelace ever escaped or she found him somewhere not in his cage, we'd have a problem. Well, Shoelace escaped. I looked everywhere, under my dressers, in the drawers, in the closet, but he was nowhere to be found. I was freaking out because I just got that snake like 3 days ago, and I didn't want my mom to kill me. I had to think of something fast, so I went out and bought a replacement snake from Petco. This one was easy to pass off as Shoelace, and in the meantime, I could try to find the little bastard when I wasn't at work. A foolproof plan, really. Except one day my mom calls me while I'm working to tell me that I need to come home right now, because my snake is on the toilet seat. I race home, and sitting there in my bathroom like a smug reptilian piece of shit is the original Shoelace. My mom is screaming. I grab my snake, and into the cage he goes. I'm so relieved he finally turned up, but silently dying inside because now I have 2 snakes to worry about. Eventually, a friend agreed to take in the replacement snake, but in the days leading up to that, I had to act like there was only one snake in that cage. Shortly after the bathroom fiasco, my mom got curious about snakes and kept wanting to hold Shoelace, and every time she was in my room, I'd be silently praying to God that she didn't notice that second little head peeping out from under the cork bark. To this day, I still haven't told my mom there were 2 snakes. Story 31. God has a funny way of telling people exactly what they want to hear. I dated a girl in college who was a virgin and extremely Catholic. She felt guilty about everything. Eventually, through months of baby steps, we finally had sex, and at the moment of her first orgasm ever, she burst into tears. She said, literal quote, "I'm going to hell. I could feel my soul leaving my body." Now let me tell you, it was one of the proudest moments of my life when a girl told me I just fucked the soul right out of her body, and I managed not to laugh. So there were tears and guilt, and a lot of crap that I knew was going to be the price of entry, so I stuck it out and said it was okay when she insisted we were never doing that again. Just a few days later we were making out again, and suddenly she's tearing our clothes off because she can't get it inside her fast enough. I was like, WTF, in my head. You didn't think I'd stop to ask that out loud, did you? When we were done, though, my curiosity got the better of me and I asked, so what happened to we're never doing that again? She says, oh, I talked to God about it, and he said sex was his gift to us. She literally for 19 years believed sex was a sin, and if you had sex before marriage, you'd go to hell. Until she found out sex was awesome, then suddenly the big guy was all thumbs up for it. Later, after we broke up and she started dating a guy from her church, she called me up saying to keep her new relationship pure, God told her to have sex with me to control her urges. I'm not proud of what happened after that. But anyway, that's the story about the time that God was a divine wingman and got me laid. Story 32. In 1999, I was a senior in high school and performing a fun and innocent senior prank towards the end of the school year was tradition for us, as is most American high schools. There were various bands of me and my fellow seniors conjuring up innocent and fun ideas to somehow get school canceled for the day. Being a bit of a merry prankster myself, I was happy to take the lead on communicating, organizing, and executing the prank. Much infighting ensued about what to do between the various senior cliques. We were deadlocked and plans had all but fizzled. A breakthrough came when my father made my brother and I helped clean out a neighbor's garage packed to the brim with 40-plus years of junk. Didn't take long for me to open a box and find what looked like a stick of dynamite labeled marine smoke flare, or something like that. This was absolutely not getting thrown out and found a new home in the trunk of my car. April 20th was right around the corner, and as most of us in high school were stoners, I thought it'd be funny to light it off somewhere that day. Fast forward to April 20th, 99, and no prank had officially been settled on amongst the cliques. I decided on a whim during a very unsupervised study period, and without telling a soul, I said, "F it," went to the student parking lot, grabbed the marine smoke flare out of my trunk, and headed for the main stairwell. The main stairwell was the only stairwell that connected all 3 floors of our relatively small high school. More importantly, there was a small shaft between the looping stairs that went from the 3rd floor to the basement floor, so I ignited the smoke flare and dropped it down the shaft and boogied back to study hall without anyone knowing I was gone. Mind you, my study hall room was probably the furthest room in the school from the main hallway, so I figured no one would suspect me. Maybe a minute later the fire alarm went off and the reality of the situation hit home. As me and fellow students stepped into the hallway to exit the school, the entire hallway outside the study hall was filled with thick blue smoke. This hallway was 1 floor up and far from where I actually lit off the smoke flare, and the smoke was so thick we couldn't find the exit. I couldn't imagine how thick the smoke was in the stairwell and adjacent hallways connected to it. I was instantly filled with deep regret, and my nerves were beyond shook. I thought I was going to puke. Did I just trap and kill the entire high school for a stupid senior prank? We literally had to crawl on our hands and knees and hug the wall until we saw the bright orange light of the exit sign. We were choking, gasping on the smoke, but managed to get out safely. Upon exiting the building, it seemed like all the town's police and fire trucks were already on scene. I was actually impressed with their response time, but the reason for that will come in a few. As the firemen geared up and rushed inside, Police and teachers ushered all of us as far away from the school as was safe. It was then when I turned back and got the full glimpse of the situation. Out of almost every open door, window, and orifice that led outside poured the thickest, dankest, bluest smoke I'd ever seen. I'd come to find out later that the smoke flare I ignited is used for when you're stranded at sea and can cover a number of square miles with smoke. Hundreds of students and teachers surrounded the entire school in bewilderment and fear of what was transpiring, some hysterically crying. Parents had caught word and began racing to the school to make sure their little Johnny and Susie were all right. Understandably. At one point I remember being so weak, afraid, remorseful that I actually fell to my knees and laid down. I literally couldn't move. I just knew at any moment firefighters would start emerging from the school with dead students, friends, and teachers. The police presence had grown from the township cops to the county SWAT unit, who were decked out in heavy military gear. My life once again flashed before my eyes. That was it. I was going away for life. That thought would not stop racing through my mind. It was about 2 hours into the whole ordeal when the smoke finally cleared out of the school. I hadn't seen any bodies or injuries pulled out, and the students were no longer crying. It seemed an air of calm began to emerge. The SWAT team was the first to leave, and the cops and firefighters were kind of joking around with each other, so I began to feel that maybe at the very least I wasn't going to jail for murder. The scene had cleared, and there were in fact no injuries or deaths. Thank fucking Christ. Deemed safe to re-enter, the entire school was then ushered into the gym where almost immediately police began interrogating students. Rumors were flying off the gym walls about who knew what about what. Of course, I reunited with my closest crew in the gym corner and began speculating about the situation, but like I said before, I hadn't told a soul about what I planned to do and ultimately did. And I knew in the seriousness of that moment that I couldn't tell anyone. Not even my closest homies who I had done some very questionable/criminal things with before. The police and school admin opted to keep the entire school on lockdown in the gym for the remainder of the day. Interestingly enough, every single one of my friends and cliques involved in planning a senior prank had been thoroughly interrogated, except for me. I was f***ing dumbfounded to say the least. The eeriest part about the entire day happened right before we were finally allowed to leave. Police informed everyone that during this senior prank, 2 students in Columbine, Colorado, had entered their high school armed to the teeth and massacred 15 students and teachers. Of course, the police knew this and thought there was a connection between the two, hence the massive police presence. This obviously did not make me feel any better. Over the following weeks, the interrogations continued, and the prank was the talk of the town, but nothing came of it as I kept the entire story to myself. I was absolutely dying to tell my closest friends what I had pulled off, but knew one peep of it would be my demise. The school year came to a close shortly thereafter, and so did the investigation. I absolutely could not believe that I was never once interrogated or even questioned about the incident given my willingness to lead the charge on planning the senior prank that year. I spent a great deal of time after that moment reflecting on how incredibly stupid of a thing it was for me to do and can't even express how thankful I am no one was hurt or killed. But after all was said and done, I was proud of myself for keeping a secret like that from oozing out of my stupid pubescent mouth. It saved me from serious jail time, and for that I have no regrets. A few months passed before I told a buddy, and of course it took no time for it to spread amongst the inner circle of my crew. They knew the gravity of the situation and who needed to know, and who didn't. Story 33. In elementary school, we had a program called DRE where a police officer would come into our class and teach us about the dangers of substance and alcohol abuse. At the end of the year, he prompted us to write an essay about what we learned over the course of the year in DRE. He also advised us that the author of the best essay in the class would receive a stuffed lion, appropriately named Darren. Now I really wanted this lion, but the problem with that was my writing skills were those of a typical 3rd grader. There was no way that anything I wrote about my time in DRE would stand out enough from my fellow classmates to win Darren. So I did what any desperate 10-year-old would do. Googled DRE essay contest winners, and then plagiarized the first one that came up in my searches. Now this was done diligently, carefully proofreading to ensure that I wasn't going to turn in an essay with somebody else's name in it somewhere. I went through and changed phrasing or a word here and there, but by no means would it pass through Turnitin, with less than 90% plagiarized. Confident in my chances of winning Darren, I turned in the essay to Mr. Officer, and what do you know? A week later, we had our end-of-year reception at the municipal building, which also contained the police station. He listed the top 3 essays, 3rd place, 2nd place, and then he said, holding Darren, the best DRE essay submitted this year was written by you, Soikori. Come on up here, get your Darren stuffed animal, and read your essay to us, please. I was so excited I won the animal. It was never even a thought that crossed my mind that I would have to deliver this speech. So I reluctantly walked up, took my stuffed animal, and all I can remember at this point is shaking so bad, it looked like I was going to fall over at the mic. All of my classmates, all of their parents, and the entire local municipality's worth of police officers with their full attention on me, a 10-year-old little fraud of a student. To this day, it's one of my most shameful moments, and I still have Darren sitting on my desk for discouragement from copying others' work. Story 34. When I was 17, I worked at a grocery store with a guy named Brian. Normal guy, mid-20s, lil chub. Didn't really think much of him. One day he tells me about how he lives in an apartment by himself and that his neighbors are absolutely crazy. Like they would yell at him to be quiet, pound against the wall to get him to shut up, even though he wouldn't be doing anything. He would sneeze, and his neighbors would scream at the top of their lungs from next door. It was that bad. TBH, I didn't really care much when he was telling me this. I just wanted to go home and not work anymore. Couple days go by and I noticed that Brian wasn't showing up anymore. Whatever. Didn't think much of that either. A month or 2 goes by and he finally shows back up to work. So, being the nice friend I am, I asked him where he's been. He tells me he was actually fired because he was in the hospital. I didn't think that was a valid reason to fire someone, but what do I know? I didn't comment on that. I asked him why he was in the hospital and he told me it was for personal reasons. I tell him it was good having him back and carried on with my day. Fast forward a couple days to me talking to another coworker who was good friends with Brian. He says, "Did you hear what happened to Brian? Yeah, he was in the hospital and was fired or something." "Do you know why though?" "No, he said it was personal." So this is what happened a couple months ago before Brian disappeared. He was at home by himself when his neighbors, surprise, start yelling at him through the walls for being too loud. Brian, telling himself, "I've had enough," decides to call the police and have them deal with it. The police arrived and started talking to the neighbors for quite some time. Hours go by with the police and neighbors. So he calls the police again to ask what's taking so long. The police respond with, "We left like an hour and a half ago." Turns out that the neighbors were never yelling at him. In fact, they were never there. Brian was schizophrenic and was hearing voices in his head. He had to go to a mental hospital for a month. Story 36. I haven't been able to really tell this story since it's so strange. When I was a night shift CNA at assisted living, I had a resident have a wild week. When I was doing my rounds at midnight, she came barreling out of her room with her cross and white as a ghost. I asked if she had a nightmare, and she responded, "There is a man in my room telling me to get out of his room." I peeked inside her room and saw it was empty. I was still internally set on her dreaming. She walked around with me most of that night. The next night was even more bizarre. I have a pager that lets me know if any residents need help or if any doors are opened. Well, it's 2 a.m. and the front door alarm goes off. That freaked me out since all the doors were locked. As I head up to the front to investigate, I see that resident with the door wide open and looking up at the sky. I asked her what she was doing, and she replied, "Death is coming for X, I have to let him in." For days she kept talking about the angry man in her room. How he kept her up, he yelled at her, and threw things on the floor. My curiosity got the best of me. "X, what does the man look like?" As she described him, my heart sank. She was perfectly describing a resident who lived in the room previously who passed away. "You didn't like anyone in his room. Did he ever tell you his name?" I asked. She looked at me. "It's X, his name." I asked the other workers if anyone mentioned anything about that resident. All have denied. She was moved to another room 2 days later after her family was very concerned for her well-being. Her nightmares have since stopped. Another resident has moved into the room and hasn't had any problems. I've had bizarre things happen to me working at that facility, but nothing has topped that one. Story 37. This happened when I was living in Berlin. A middle-aged graying guy, seemingly African-American, who was dressed pretty shabbily boarded the U1 subway on a Sunday morning with a foldable chair and an old clarinet, I guess. He sat in the chair in front of the door and played an out-of-tune Spider-Man theme song on it, and then started talking to me and two Italian girls sitting beside me. He claimed to be an ex-math professor at the MIT who left his job and is going around the world warning people about. Insert a large X number of nuclear reactors in the northern hemisphere that are about to go off anytime soon, and no one is doing anything about it. I was pretty amused at this point, but he kept talking and asked about me. I told him I was a comp-sci student, so he asked me to name any comp-sci books that he might have read. I named a few of the popular ones and he blew raspberries and said, of course, to each of them. He then went on to recommend me a book on math that I had never heard about, which I later looked up, and it seemed to be a very interesting and high-rated book. At some point during the conversation, he also claimed, the name of his PhD supervisor, who I also later looked up, but I don't remember finding him online. I have to say his voice was very loud and his speech was a bit slurred. By this time, a few of the fellow passengers asked him to keep it down, saying that they were being disturbed. At the next stop, while getting off, a young lady said to him, "You're giving me a headache on a Sunday morning." At this point, he asked me if I thought he was loud, and I was put in a weird spot, so I just said, "Yeah, a bit." So he just got up and said to everyone, "You know what? Y'all, the nuclear reactors are gonna go off very soon," turned towards the door, and got off at the next stop. I don't think I will ever forget this encounter. Story 38. I grew up in a very conservative household. Sex was never talked about at all, and you knew if you got caught with something you shouldn't, you'd be in giant trouble. When I was 17, I bought a vibrator. I had literally no experience, even alone, but was super curious. The way it worked was you had to screw the bottom off it on to keep the batteries in and to turn it on. I put it underneath my bed and thought I had it unscrewed enough that it would stay off until later. Well, I'm downstairs listening to a CD player with my headphones on, and suddenly I hear my two young sisters yelling about something and running around the house. I take my headphones off and I hear "Bees echoing through the house. My room was directly above the living room, and my floor was wooden. They're feeling out, thinking there's a wasp in the house or something electrical is about to explode. Thank God my parents weren't home. They probably would have figured it out a lot easier. One sister runs upstairs, realizes it's coming from my room, and I dash ahead of her and just throw myself over the bed to feel underneath it. I turn off the vibrator and then tell them my old phone was under there and must have had an alarm on it, which made no sense. It had been months since I changed phones. They don't believe me and think it must be the pipes under my room. They tell my parents when they get home that the pipes freaked out. My family listens closely for months to see if we need to call a plumber. I decided to take my terrible secret to the grave. Story 39. Remember when the world was supposed to end in December 21st, 2012? That night a bunch of my friends and I were hanging out in my apartment, smoking a lot of weed and playing games. We made a bunch of jokes about the world not having ended. I was pretty young and dumb, so I actually had some anxiety about that. It felt good to laugh it off. We go on my balcony to have a cigarette and watch the sunset. Out of nowhere, there's an enormous explosion, and the sky flashes lime green. We all stop talking and stare as the sky flashes green, pink, yellow, and there are these crazy, indescribable crackling noises. I'm stoned as a bitch, and I decide this is it. It's happening. I go into emergency preparedness mode for the alien invasion and for some reason start filling my bathtub with water. I think it was so we'd have water to drink if we were hiding from aliens and the water lines got interrupted. I'm stupid. We all run around yelling and freaking the fuck out for about 5 minutes while the sky continues to strobe neon colors. So what had happened was a transformer blew somewhere nearby. No idea that this was what happened in that circumstance, but due to the date, I was not the only one to lose it. My mother was out and one of her companions fell to her knees and started praying the rosary for the second coming when the sky started changing colors. Story 40. To summarize the background, I had basically no money because it was all tied up in my bail after I was arrested after being the victim of a violent crime. Long story, very traumatic, but stuff I've been able to talk about. But I was short for rent. Only like $50, but still more than I could ask anyone to spot me. And I was desperate. My landlord was ruthless about kicking people out. There was no late rent, it was just either you paid in full on time or you were fully out in 48 hours. So I went on Grindr and found a man who would pay me $50 for sex. My options were very limited cause my town was super small, only a couple hundred people. And he was old and fat and gross, and it was painful and unpleasant, and I did things I would never normally do, but like I needed $50, you know? And I felt so terrible afterwards. I felt disgusting. And I tried to talk to one of my friends about it, but she just didn't get it. Like, but you were gay, and you're into the dad bod/bear types, right? And you have sex all the time, and you even got money for it. I mean, it was just like, since I'm sexually active anyway, this should be a step up, since I'm both having sex and making money. But it wasn't. It was violating. It was terrible. But as soon as I brought up like, I got paid for it, she was saying I should be happy about it, right? That it was a victory for me, that I should even keep doing it to make more money. So I just stopped trying to talk about it, 'cause I felt even worse, like I felt terrible for doing it, and I felt terrible for feeling terrible about doing it. I expected the most sympathy from her because she'd gone through something kind of similar, like she had been sexually assaulted, but everyone blamed her for it because she was sexually active. And like, having sex for money isn't the same as being sexually assaulted, but I at least didn't expect, you're having sex anyway, so what's the problem to come from her? So I just haven't tried to talk to anyone else about it, and that was about a year ago, and still when I think about it my chest tightens and it's hard to get out of my head, and I just want to take 100 showers and then lay on the floor. But mostly I want to talk to my friends about it and receive affirmations of, yeah, that sounds like it probably sucked, instead of, whoa-ho, use your body, get that bread. Story 41. It started when these 4 boys around 10 or 11 would walk past my house every week to go swimming, and every week, for weeks in a row, outside my house the same kid got shat on by a massive crow. Obviously we found this really funny and didn't make the connection at the time he must have done something to piss the crow off. I was putting bird food out in my garden, but I was getting loads of feral pigeons, so I was trying to shoo them away, which this crazy crow must have taken offense to. Soon after I noticed that I was getting cawed at by crows all the time. No matter where I went there was angry crows cawing at me. That's when I Googled crows and saw that they can hold grudges, recognize people, tell other crows about bad people. So I tried to make a peace offering by throwing food on my shed roof. My kitchen window, with the sink in front of it, overlooks the shed roof. After throwing food out, I stood by the window doing the dishes. This must have also pissed this crow off. Later that day, a crow started absolutely screeching and cawing. I went through to the kitchen to see what was going on when a huge bird shit landed on my window. In 20 years, there has been no bird shit on that window because there is a big ledge above it. So this crow must have hung its butt over the ledge just to do that. I went to bed that night only to be woken up at 5 a.m. by screaming right outside my bedroom window. I live on the first floor, so it couldn't have been a human. I Googled crow screaming, and sure enough, that was the noise I heard. It had chosen the only window with a light on to do that. Later on that day, there was a big crow sitting on a tree near that window. If anyone else went to the window, it just stayed still, but if it saw me, it started bouncing on the branch, like it thought it was funny. Obviously, after the shitting and screaming, I wasn't going to give it any food that day. I did give it food the next day, and it must have taken the hint because it never shat on my windows or woke me up by screaming again. However, for about a year and a half, every crow for a mile radius round my house would angrily caw at me. Story 42. My brother asked me to create a creepy scavenger hunt for him and his friends for a Halloween party. I had 2 hours to prepare and only one other person with me. This is what I came up with. They were handed a forged letter from the asylum in the city next to ours, explaining how a high-threat patient needed to be transported in a white van. They walked around until they saw a white van out in our back field with its caution lights on. When they got closer, they saw the sides were smeared with blood and a journal laid partially destroyed in the front seat, telling them to go to the front of the house. Walking back towards the house, they saw all the lights turn off at once. My friend hit the breaker. Once inside, they were freaking out and found another note by the front that had been scratched out and rewritten by the psycho. It was mostly babble, but they could make out a few words like upstairs, little girl's room, and mirror. They cautiously went into my little sister's room and found a note written backwards. Once they held it up to the mirror to read it, my friend ran by the window on the roof directly behind them so they could see him in the mirror. This got them going, haha. The note said, "Follow the knock." After a few minutes, a knocking came from across the hall in my room. They slowly made their way in, but it took a while. The next note was by the psycho who was ranting again and told them to get something sharp to defend themselves. They ran to the knife drawer and found hundreds of shreds of paper with the words "knives, where are the knives?" maybe in the basement. Now it took them maybe 30 minutes to convince themselves to go down. After searching, they found a crawl space in the closet with the door removed. There was a note that was stabbed into the wall with the psycho's pin that read, "Come on in." Once they worked up the courage to climb in, my friend in black ran down the basement stairs and the door to the closet slammed shut and they lost it. The thing is, this is as far as I got in the little time they gave me to come up with the scavenger hunt. So we just kept wandering the house cause I didn't want it to end. They accused me saying my friend was the psycho, so I made him change and pretend to pull up to the house and he asked them what was going on. We were sitting in the kitchen and heard loud screaming sound. Me and my friend froze and stared at each other wide-eyed. We were like, "Are you doing this? What is happening?" After shitting myself, my dog came downstairs and then threw up. For the second time, it must have been him making the noise. It scared all of us more than anything, and my brother started crying and woke up my parents and I got in trouble. His friends never came over again, and I felt kinda bad the end. Story 43. I'm from the US. So between my sophomore and junior years of college, I studied abroad for a summer semester in Spain. We would be there for about 5 weeks, so we had about 3 weekends to do whatever we wanted. The other 2 weekends were spent traveling there and back. A group of us decided that we wanted to go to Paris for a long weekend and booked the flights and the rest of the arrangements. Here we are, flying out to Paris in our second week in Europe, and everyone is really excited. We land at the airport and jump on a bus to go to our hostel, and about 30 minutes into the trip, I needed my wallet for something. I'm searching everywhere for my wallet. Everywhere. It is nowhere to be found. I'm pissed. It had my ID, every bit of cash for my weekend trip, my cards, everything. So naturally, I'm in full freak the fuck out mode. There's really nothing to do about it, and we arrive at the hostel and I have nothing to pay for my room. Reluctantly, I use the phone to call my dad, who thankfully picked up, and we defeat the language barrier and he pays for my weekend stay in the hostel. Now, I have a place to stay at least, but no way to pay for any of the activities we planned. The next morning, I'm stuck in the hostel and I reluctantly call my dad again, and he says he will wire me some cash. I'm in a foreign land and don't speak the language, so I basically wander around, alone, in the streets of Paris trying to find a place to get my cash. After an hour of searching, I figure it out. We get the cash sent through, and now I can enjoy my vacation. This is the crazy part. A year later, I read a thing online about hidden Facebook messages. Something pretty much like a spam folder for your Facebook messages. I'm curious, so I jump on and look at my spam folder. I see a curious message, read it, and I'll be damned if it isn't a flight attendant from the flight that I lost my wallet on, and wondering if it was mine and how to get it back to me. A full fucking year later, and if I would have checked my spam folder, I wouldn't have had to go the rest of my trip without my wallet. Story 44. I went to a Skrillex show in 2010 when he was a big deal in the rave community. After the show, my friend and I are having a smoke around the back of the venue when Skrillex and his posse come out the back doors. We get a few pictures and ask him if he wants to split the L joint we had rolled for after the show. He takes one look at us, up and down, and says, "Sure. Meet me at our hotel. We will be in the tour bus around the back. See you in a bit." Hugh's shitting ourselves. We remain cool on the surface and tell him we'll see him there. We jump in the car and drive to the hotel where he was staying, about 20 minutes away. As we start pulling around the back, we don't see a tour bus anywhere and start to think the whole thing is just a ruse put on to amuse bored musicians on long tours. Then, tucked away in the back of the parking lot is a large black bus. We walk up, and as I go to knock on the door, Skrillex busts open the door and gives me the most sincere, "You're my new best friend" hug and yells, "You made it." We enter the bus and he introduces us to his friends, his tour manager, and Zed, who he was touring with at the time. We go in the back of the bus and smoke some weed. He plays us some music that hadn't been released yet, and we chat about your usual high guy shit. He tells us about never wearing the same pair of underwear twice on tour and some other shit I don't remember because at this point I thought I had to be dreaming. We are there an hour or so when the door busts open and in walks another DJ, Porter Robinson, high as shit on likely Molly. He starts demanding a dance party, so Zed plays a personal show for about 8 of us, and we dance and smoke until the sun came up. At the time, it was absolutely legendary. I will never forget it, and I tell it every chance I can. Story 45. In middle school one year, we had to create a PowerPoint presentation on Babe Ruth. It was our first time learning PowerPoint, and so we all had to report to the computer lab each day to do it. The lab teacher there, let's call her Mrs. H, was there to get us set up and then to help us when we needed it. So she tells us the basics and off we go. I'm picking it up pretty quickly, and soon I realize I want to do something a little different. I eventually find an audio clip of a radio broadcast of the at-bat in which Babe Ruth famously points to center field before hitting a home run in that exact spot on the next pitch. I was ecstatic. I was going to have the best presentation in the class. It was such a neat little clip. My teacher was going to be so impressed. I was surely going to get an A+ on the project. Except, I didn't exactly know how to do it. So I called on Mrs. H to help me. She walked me through it, step by step, and I finally was able to add it. I'm so excited I end up finishing the rest of the PowerPoint that day. So, the next day comes around. We're back in the computer lab. The rest of the class is a little behind, so Mrs. H begins by sharing some tips to everyone on how to improve their presentations. She says you can even add audio clips to your PowerPoints if you want. So she starts demonstrating how one would do that. And as an example, she says she found this really cool clip of a radio broadcast of Babe Ruth's famous called Home Run. She goes on to explain to the whole class how to import this clip into your project. I just sat there in complete amazement. Like, did this really just take credit for finding that clip and then tell the whole class how to use it? I was a pretty timid kid, so I really had no idea how to react. I just sat at my computer for the rest of the class doing nothing. The next day, the class presented their PowerPoints. Every single kid had that audio clip in their presentation. Mrs. H. Story 46. So my story starts on what was a normal day taking calls on the front line for a large cable company. The job pays well, and for the most part, the people I deal with are fairly nice to talk to. Quite often we'll get calls from seniors, especially in the morning, who have premise equipment issues such as snow on screen or no signal on their TV sets connected to our digital equipment. Now my heart does go out to some of these folk, because up until recently past few years, we would supply straight analog cable to many homes, coaxed direct from wall to TV with scrolling guide. However, most cities we service nowadays require our digital equipment to receive channels, and this has caused a lot of frustration with older people who don't know how to operate said equipment, i.e. always having your TV set on video or HDMI to get picture. So oftentimes we get customers who are repeat offenders with long ticket histories of these types of issues. So anyway, I get a call from an older gentleman who's quite bitter and mean right off the bat. Doesn't like that I asked for his address/telephone number to verify the account, hates that he has to speak with a machine before reaching an agent, etc. I have some experience handling these types of customers. However, this call was going to be a little different. I spent over 45 minutes with this guy, we'll call him Mr. Smith, trying to get his TV set connected to the digital box properly so he could receive a picture. No luck. He was getting clearly frustrated by the whole ordeal and started blaming me for not being able to do my job properly, how I was useless, etc. Whatever. Like I said, I've dealt with this before, so I tried my best not to take it personally, but eventually I had to ask him if we could book a service tech to the home, a courtesy call, to get his TV working correctly. Unfortunately, our booking calendar was showing an appointment 3 days out. That's when he dropped this on me. Don't bother sending a goddamn technician, because I'll be dead by then. I'm 94 and TV is the only thing I have left. Are you really going to make me wait for a tech? I instantly felt bad. I mean, I've heard every complaint in the book as to why people don't want to wait for a tech, but this one kind of got to me. I'm in my mid-20s, so honestly, I can't even imagine how it must feel to utter those words. So I spoke with my supervisor, who said they'd see if we could get someone out earlier, but we couldn't promise anything. So I let Mr. Smith know, and he was predictably not very happy with my answer. At that point, it almost sounded like he started to cry and went into how he has no family left and no friends that come visit. This was after I asked if there was anyone in his building that might be able to help. Man, I felt terrible, so I took it upon myself to ask Mr. Smith if I could pay a visit. He lived in a small city over from where I was, not very far to drive. He was a little shocked I was willing to do this, but sounded thankful I was willing to come out and help him personally. So I head over, get to the residence, and meet him. Within 30 seconds, I had the cable running again, simple input change, and even brought him a simplified remote for his set-top box to avoid this problem in the future. That's when he started crying. He goes into how he hasn't actually spoken or really interacted with anyone for years. He gave me a hug and told me how thankful he was that I came out and helped him, and told me how sorry he was for being so mean earlier on. I said it was no problem and I was happy to help, and that was it. I left. 3 weeks later, my supervisor comes to my desk and asks me if I could come speak with her for a bit about an account for Mr. Smith. Turns out, he sent the cable company a letter outlining how thankful he was for helping him with his issue and how it really made an old man happy again for once in a very long time. The letter was framed and put on our front entrance to retail. I guess the moral of this story is no matter how nasty someone is to you over the phone, sometimes they're not always a terrible person and just going through a lot. I still think about Mr. Smith occasionally when I get those nasty customers, and it makes me feel a little better. Story 47. I'm a delivery driver for a small local pizza chain. I've been there for 3.5 years, and to this day, I haven't had a stranger interaction than the one I'm about to tell. This is going to sound fake, but I genuinely assure you it's all true. It's maybe a year into my pizza slinging career. I get a delivery to a place I had never been before, a very small gated community at the end of a back street on the far edge of our delivery zone. When I say small, I mean small. It's about 1.5 blocks deep, maybe 10 houses total in the whole area. The order I get is huge. Enough to fill 2 medium-sized pizza bags, about 8 large pies, and 2 large brown paper bags, maybe 4 or 5 items per bag, not to mention the 2-liter beverages. It's late in my particular shift, maybe around 9:30 at night. I was supposed to be heading home, but my boss asked me to stay later that night, so I had to take it. I put it all into my car and drive to the gated community. Thankfully, the customer gave me a gate code. I type it in the call box outside and wait. It rings and rings and rings. Eventually, there is a very loud sound, like feedback from a microphone. Then silence. I wait to see if maybe the gate was going to open or something, but no dice. I type in the gate code again, but this time there is a loud beep and the gates open. I'd never been in this gated community before, and the addresses were numbered from 1 to 10. However, the way the houses are aligned make no sense compared to a traditional block layout. The addresses are also very oddly placed and not easily visible from far away or in the dark. This was also before I got glasses and my vision was awful. Anyway, I find the house. It's a large, beautiful, modern-looking mansion. Big, white stone pillars outside. A fountain of porcelain fish spitting water. A driveway that looked tiled, with a Lexus and Audi parked in it. There were small lights along the pathway that led up to their house, as well as lights in the ground that were so bright they illuminated the stone pillars. I park out front and walk up the pathway, carrying this large order of food. I arrive at double doors, placing down the pizza bags. Both doors are mostly glass you can look right into. There is a very bright porch light that illuminates when I step towards the doors. I look into the doors and see a large foyer. Beautiful white-tiled floors, a large double spiral staircase on either end of the foyer that lead upstairs, a large glass table in the center of the foyer with what I can only describe as a small palm tree on it. In the corner, underneath the right staircase, is a gorgeous, huge black grand piano. Sitting behind the piano, I can just see the left side of a middle-aged man. He's wearing green scrubs and just sort of looking at the piano keys. The top of the piano is obviously open, and the staircase in front of him just barely allow me to see his face. As I go to knock, he looks directly at me. We make eye contact. I know this guy can see me. Regardless, I knock on the glass door. The man then looks down at the piano and begins to play masterfully. I could hear it faintly through the door, but it sounded as if I was listening to a professional recording. From my music theory class in college, I recognized it to be Beethoven's For Elise. I stand there for a second and just kind of wait. I'm not sure what to do. I notice the guy keeps looking up towards me, but he doesn't stop playing. Y'all, when I say he played the whole song, he played all of it. All 3 minutes. I even knocked again in the middle of it, but he still didn't come to the door. When he finished the song, he looked up once more, stood up, and what happened next, I'll never forget. The man in scrubs steps out from behind the grand piano, and from behind his marbled staircase and perched on his uncovered arm is a macaw. Yes, a macaw, one of those bright, colorful, huge parrots you see at the zoo. Bright blue and yellow. My jaw just kind of drops open because I was so confused at this point. The man opens the door and in a very monotone voice says, "Hello there." I stammer out a hello. "How are you this evening?" "Fine," the man says, his face a blank slate. No expression of joy or sadness or anger or anything. I look at the parrot, who is making a low, throaty humming/chirping noise as it stares at me. I reach into my pocket and pull out my pen and his credit card receipt to sign. "I just need you to sign this for me," I say, reaching out to hand him the pen and receipt. All of a sudden, the bird goes fucking bonkers, screeching and flapping its wings at me, trying to peck at my hand. The bird had a name, and its name was Sophie. The man immediately pulled the bird away and was like, "Sophie. No. No, Sophie. No." He reached his free hand out, and I passed him what he needed. He turned away to the large glass table behind him with the palm tree. He is still whispering to the bird, but I can't hear what he's saying. As he's filling out the receipt, I hear a voice call from the top of the stairs. Honey, don't forget to give the man the coupon." It's a woman's voice. The man doesn't respond, just keeps filling out the receipt and mumbling to the bird. Suddenly, the woman, I'm assuming his wife, appears at the top of the stairs. She's a breathtaking brunette, maybe less than 10 years older than me, about half this man's age. She's wearing a red silk robe, half opened. She begins to walk down the stairs, asking the man, "Sweetie, did you give the man?" "I got it," the man screams at her. The woman turns back around and quickly goes back up the stairs. The man finally turns back around and walks over to me. Sophie starts freaking out again. In my head, all I can think is, why doesn't this guy put the bird down? He hands me back the receipt and looks at Sophie, who is cawing at me. He looks back to me and says, "Could you hand me everything one at a time so I can bring it to put on the table?" I look at Sophie, then back to him, and I'm like, sure thing. So I literally hand this man one pizza at a time, then both 2-liter beverages, then both brown bags. This whole process takes at least 5 minutes because Sophie keeps flipping the out every time I put my hand out with an item. The guy also walks super slow and takes his time putting everything down. We finally get to the last bag of food, and I zip up my delivery bag. I pass the man his final bag. He looks me dead in the eyes, with that same blank stare, and says without any emotion, "I'm sorry about that," he says. "I would have taken more at a time, but as you can see, I'm a little overburdened at the moment." Then he closed the door in my face and walked away. I've never seen that man or bird since. Story 48. I used to occasionally drive through a pretty empty stretch of desert for work. It was about 3 hours or so of near emptiness and no gas stations. I'd probably meet 2, maybe 3 cars over the course of my drive. The road passed through a couple of very tiny and mostly empty towns, but was generally far from anywhere. On one trip, I was making my way along the old two-lane road and was just cresting a hill when I saw a lone figure at the bottom, walking slowly up the hill along the side of the road. Being a desert, there was a long stretch of straight road before me, and I had a spell to observe the figure as I drew closer. The person seemed to be wearing a white robe and was hunched over. It quickly became obvious that the figure was carrying something on its back. At the same time, I noticed a flash in my rearview mirror. Glancing up, I saw a car come roaring over the hill behind me. It was a large Cadillac, and it quickly dashed into the opposite lane and shot past me down the hill. As I watched the car fly down the hill, I realized that the figure at the bottom was dragging a long piece of wood behind them. With a good length of it resting on their shoulder, it looked like a large wooden cross. The car finally reached the figure and came to a screeching halt in the middle of the road, while I continued to gradually close the gap between us. At that point, the figure turned, revealing a short beard, and hefted the wooden cross off the ground and onto his back. He bounded as quickly across the road as one could with a cross, long brown hair trailing in the breeze, and reached the car just as the trunk lid popped open. The man attempted to put the cross into the trunk, but it wouldn't fit. Giving up, he left the trunk lid open and jumped into the passenger seat. The car screeched off, slid into the dirt, spun around, and bounced back onto the pavement in a cloud of dust. As the dust settled, the car lurched forward and raced back up the hill, as if on a mission. As it passed my car, I noticed the driver, sporting shiny aviators, steering coolly with one hand while leaning back in the seat. The passenger had his head stuck out the window, staring at me as the car passed and drove off into the distance. They quickly reached the top of the hill and dropped out of sight as the cross hung out of the trunk, bouncing precariously against the bumper. I stared into the mirror for a moment, half expecting them to reappear, before I realized I wasn't paying attention and resumed driving. I've seen a lot of odd stuff in the desert, but that was one of the strangest. Story 49. My cat Maxwell just died, so this is probably an appropriate time to share my weirdest story about him. This happened about 3 weeks after we had first gotten Max. I was around 8 or 9 at the time, and I was attending one of those weekly day camps for kids whose parents don't have time to entertain them over the summer. I had just gotten home and was chilling in the playroom upstairs. Now, one thing to note about Max is that he was a very friendly cat. He would greet me at the door every day and snuggle with me upstairs while I indulged in some Ed, and Eddie. So, you can probably imagine my surprise when Max wasn't at the door and didn't show up after an entire episode of Teen Titans. After another 30-minute block of programming, I began to grow worried about my furry friend's absence. But then suddenly I heard something, a sound I had grown very accustomed to over the past few weeks, Max's meowing. I could hear it coming from somewhere in the room, and eventually pinpointed the noise to the wall next to my Lego shelf. It's worth noting at this point that the night before this incident occurred, we had been having some issues with the house's alarm system going off randomly. Because of this, workers from the security company had been dicking around in our attic all morning, trying to combat the problem. Anyway, now that I realized where the meowing was coming from, I immediately flipped a shit, or spazzed out as I probably would have said back then, and ran to get my mom. She came and took a listen, and confirmed that the dumb bastard was indeed in the wall, still meowing away. At this point, my mom decided to call animal control, and they said that they could either charge us a couple $100 to send a guy over to the house and smash a hole in the wall, or we could do it ourselves. So naturally, my mom got a mallet from the garage. However, while she was gone, the unthinkable happened. Max stopped meowing again. He may not have been meowing when I entered the room initially, but now that I knew he had the capability to make sound, and that he wasn't now for some reason, I once again freaked out. After all, this was the Bible Belt South, famous for its disgustingly hot, humid summers. So of course, I feared the worst for the poor little creature trapped in what was basically an oven. When my mother returned, I told her the news, and I could see the fear in her eyes. But despite the growing uneasiness, there was still a job to do. My mom lined up the mallet, and with one fell swoop, made a nice hole in the wall. After a few seconds of waiting, nothing happened. Once again, the wall was struck, increasing the size of the hole. Unlike the last time, however, a glimmer of hope crept onto the horizon. After the second whack, the meowing started again, more panicked and frenzied than ever. The wall was then struck a third time, and out leapt the grimy, disgusting, shit-covered, literally, mess of a cat that had been trapped in a wall for hours. In our overwhelming relief, we barely even noticed how gross he was while we embraced him. After showering him off, we pieced together that he must have run up into the attic while the security guys were here, and then fallen through a hole in the floor and into the wall. Max ended up living for another 10 years with us, and just recently passed away. I miss him like crazy, but I can't help but smile when I look back on how insane this afternoon was with him. Story 50. The first day of university after Christmas, I had an exam, not very important, but an exam, because the students, I had to buy the train ticket, so I went to the ticket office, where there was a foreigner that didn't know well the language, so he lasted like 10 minutes to get the ticket. When I could finally get my ticket, I gave the guy €100 and my identity card, and at this moment, I hear the train arriving. I couldn't leave until he came back with my ticket, my ID card, and my money. After he gave me back my stuff, I ran like I have never done before, but it was too late. I had lost the train. Before continuing, let's just say that the train I lost was at 1:48, and the next one was at 2:36. It was 45 minutes of travel, so I had no chance of arriving at the exam. Well, I was waiting at the station for the next train, hoping that the teacher will let me enter if I explained him the situation. A 2:10 a.m. train I had never seen before appears it was going on the same direction that the train I usually take. I looked at the board, and it said it stopped on the station where I was going, so I jumped in. Then I checked the board, and it said that it was the train of 2:36. That was not my train. But it was too late, the doors were closed. The megaphone said it was going to Barcelona. Let's just say that it has to cross all Spain. So I was going on a train that was going to send me so many kilometers away from my home and lose an exam as well. Also, I was trapped between first class and second class, and I just had a standard ticket, so I wasn't able to enter. Here's when the good part starts. An old man opens the first class wagon and says, "Come in." So I enter. It was the best wagon I have ever entered to, with seating, with heating, and everything. I started talking with this man and his wife. They were amazing and started saying that I shouldn't worry about it and just enjoy the journey. Also, they told me that the train stopped in my town because someone used the emergency stop. They convinced me to have fun and enjoy the adventure, so here I was starting to think if I had friends in Barcelona to stay with when suddenly the megaphone says that the train will stop in the station I was going. Let me say that before the two previous stops, where we didn't stop, but I recognized. I was already starting up nervous. My legs were shaking because the revisor had just entered in the wagon, and I didn't have the ticket for first class. I got out of the wagon waiting for the train to arrive to the station. The revisor finishes with the wagon comes and tells me, "Good day," and I respond, "Good day." And he goes away. I didn't have the ticket and the revisor didn't even ask for it. Well, I arrived to the station, jumped out and saw another revisor entering in the train. The other revisor came out and asked me, "Did you have your ticket?" At this moment, the world stopped. Everything was in silence, and I thought, maybe if I explain the situation he is comprehensive and let me go. So I said, "Yes, well." And he responds, "No, don't show it. I just saw you coming out nervous, and I thought you didn't have ticket. But if you have it, it doesn't matter." So he lets me go away, and because it was a long-distance train, it was faster and didn't stop at any station, so I arrived at 2:58, and I arrived to the exam. Guys, let me tell you something. If you ever find yourself in this kind of situation, take a bit of risk. That's what I always do after this day. Sometimes it goes right and sometimes wrong, but I come back every time with a great story to tell. I have many stories I'd like to share with you, but I think it's okay for today. Story 51. Last year, I was invited to an ugly sweater Christmas party by my friend John, who I hadn't seen or talked to for a few years. John and his girlfriend showed up to see one of my sister's high school soccer games a few weeks prior, and John and I got caught up with each other a bit while taking in the game under a cool fall night under the lights out where we both grew up. His girlfriend was nice, and I always wondered over the years who he would end up with, since he has always had girls all over him in a way that would make men like Don Draper or Barney Stinson jealous. Beautiful girl, too. Big, pretty smile. It was a bit surreal for me to see John and her together. It's one thing to have thoughts in your head for years, thinking about how things might be someday. It's another thing for it to become reality and for you to be able to stare it in the face and to grip its hands when it says hello to you. I walked away from the two of them that night thinking about how much older I have gotten since I had seen John last, and how he has made great strides in becoming a man, leaving behind seemingly any and all traces of the youthful, smart aleck friend I knew from childhood many years ago. A few weeks later, I showed up at John's place in a section of the city where a lot of young professionals live who are getting their start in their careers and who are looking to date and take in the city scene with others like them. John lives with 4 other guys in a nice place not too far from the busy city center where they all work. It was my first time out there, and it was my first time seeing some of my old childhood friends in years. I honestly didn't know what to expect, since John looked more like a man when I saw him that night at my sister's game than he did a college kid like I last remembered him. I stepped inside to the party and saw a place filled with guys and girls who I didn't know. John introduced me to some of them, and I started connecting the dots and understanding how they all met up and how some of them were connected to the town where John and our friends grew up together. After talking to some of them, a few of my old friends started to show up, and it was like a reunion of sorts for me, and they greeted me with a big hug and wide eyes since we hadn't seen each other in so long. It was something else, really. They looked older, bigger, stronger, I thought, and a few of them had their girlfriends with them as well. There were no signs of the up for whatever and let's get plastered crew that I used to know. and that practically bounced off the walls and tried to chat up and hump anything that moved at parties. In their place were these straight-jawed, well-mannered guys who talked to me about what was going on in my life and with my family as if they were my priest at my local parish who I had decided to pay a visit to after so many years away from the church. It was surreal since I had never known such maturity among these guys and among people my age. I hadn't been around much over the years and hadn't seen too many people, so I was taken aback by how settled and relaxed everyone seemed as people moving further from 20 and closer towards 30 years old with each passing day. Before I could process it all, John handed me a drink. By the time that I was done with that, I realized that the party was really going strong and that the house was absolutely packed with people. I spotted some guys I used to play basketball and baseball with when we were kids and said hello to them. One said he was working in the financial district downtown and another was there with his girlfriend. He said they were engaged and the wedding was in May. It seemed like yesterday when I used to turn double plays with the former friend and won a regional championship in hoops with the latter over 10 years ago. Now they're in finance and fiancés. A girl who I went to school with from kindergarten through high school spotted me and came over to me to give me a hug and say hello. She was there with her boyfriend who went to school one township over from me. She had a crush on me in the 5th grade and asked me out. I was nervous and turned her down. She started flirting and talking with me when high school started, but I didn't get the hints. She looked great at the party. What might have been. After a few beers and after an hour or two of trying to reminisce and catch up with people over the blare of the music blasting through the sound system, I was feeling great. I couldn't help but look around the house to see kids I had grown up with fully grown and having a great night out, like we used to have in high school and before. Only now in the knowledge that these might be some of the last nights out that we ever have before we all pair off with our significant others and take the fork in the road towards the married life in the not-too-distant future. This realization filled me with a bittersweet feeling that I had never felt before. It was a feeling that sent sharp pangs throughout my body but hurt so good in that all of the good times that I had had with some of the people in that house came rushing back to me in that moment, and, for maybe one last time, I was able to recall the better times that we had had together from years ago in our childhood. John tapped me on the shoulder, snapping me out of my nostalgic haze, and introduced me to his friend DJ who he roomed with in college. We all talked for a little bit and were eventually joined by a girl who sidled up to us in a Game of Thrones sweater with a White Walker on it. She was fully committed to her outfit since she had the most piercing blue eyes that I had ever seen to go with her White Walker sweater and beautiful, white porcelain skin. The four of us started talking about her sweater and about Game of Thrones before DJ and John went to the keg for themselves and left me and this blue-eyed beauty alone. We were both buzzed and kept chatting about the show and what we thought was going to happen next season, all while staring intently at each other as if we were having the world's greatest conversation. She really was beautiful. I had my eye on her the entire night, to be honest with you. For most of that night, she was the most beautiful girl in the room, and now our eyes were locked, and I was lost in those blue eyes and had no desire to find my way out. We kept having to lean closer towards each other to hear what we were saying because the music had gotten so loud. I didn't mind because a song came on that I hadn't heard in nearly forever, and it was the only thing that could have broken my concentration on her and diverted my gaze ever so slightly from her eyes. Just as that song and its beat swelled around me and brought me back to my days in middle school where I had heard it last, she put her phone to her ear, said a few words, looked me in the eyes with those blue eyes of hers, and with a smile said, "My ride is here. See you around," and then turned away from me for what might be forever. As her wavy brown hair bobbed its way through a crowded sea of sweaters towards the exit, this song boomed and bounced perfectly in sync with her right up until the moment when she turned around slightly, looked back at me with those blue eyes of hers, and smiled before being swallowed up by the crowd, out of my sight but never out of mind. That night wasn't so much about her as it was about a night where I realized just how far my friends and I had come in life and how a night out together was going to be from here on out before they start to become a relic of our past as kids and then college guys who were always looking for the time of our lives, every night out together. We had all gotten older and grown up together, and coming to that absolute realization on that night was truly bittersweet. Whenever I hear that song, I think of that night and of that blue-eyed girl who I haven't seen since but will never forget. Story 52. The fastest guys out there. There were a lot of things we couldn't do in State Route 71, but we were the fastest guys on the block and loved reminding our fellow aviators of this fact. People often asked us if, because of this fact, it was fun to fly the jet. Fun would not be the first word I would use to describe flying this plane. Intense, maybe. Even cerebral. But there was one day in our sled experience when we would have to say that it was pure fun to be the fastest guys out there, at least for a moment. It occurred when Walt and I were flying our final training sortie. We needed 100 hours in the jet to complete our training and attain mission-ready status. Somewhere over Colorado, we had passed the century mark. We had made the turn in Arizona and the jet was performing flawlessly. My gauges were wired in the front seat and we were starting to feel pretty good about ourselves, not only because we would soon be flying real missions, but because we had gained a great deal of confidence in the plane in the past 10 months. Ripping across the barren deserts 80,000 feet below us, I could already see the coast of California from the Arizona border. I was, finally, after many humbling months of simulators and study, ahead of the jet. I was beginning to feel a bit sorry for Walter in the back seat. There he was, with no really good view of the incredible sights before us, tasked with monitoring 4 different radios. This was good practice for him for when we began flying real missions, when a priority transmission from headquarters could be vital. It had been difficult, too, for me to relinquish control of the radios, as during my entire flying career I had controlled my own transmissions. But it was part of the division of duties in this plane, and I had adjusted to it. I still insisted on talking on the radio while we were on the ground, however. Walt was so good at many things, but he couldn't match my expertise at sounding smooth on the radios, a skill that had been honed sharply with years in fighter squadrons where the slightest radio miscue was grounds for beheading. He understood that and allowed me that luxury. Just to get a sense of what Walt had to contend with, I pulled the radio toggle switches and monitored the frequencies along with him. The predominant radio chatter was from Los Angeles Center, far below us, controlling daily traffic in their sector. While they had us on their scope, albeit briefly, we were in uncontrolled airspace and normally would not talk to them unless we needed to descend into their airspace. We listened as the shaky voice of a lone Cessna pilot asked Center for a readout of his ground speed. Center replied, "November Charlie 175, I'm showing you at 90 knots on the ground." Now the thing to understand about Center controllers was that whether they were talking to a rookie pilot in a Cessna or to Air Force One, they always spoke in the exact same, calm, deep, professional tone that made one feel important. I referred to it as the Houston Center voice. I have always felt that after years of seeing documentaries on this country's space program and listening to the calm and distinct voice of the Houston controllers, that all other controllers since then wanted to sound like that, and that they basically did. And it didn't matter what sector of the country we would be flying in, it always seemed like the same guy was talking. Over the years, that tone of voice had become somewhat of a comforting sound to pilots everywhere. Conversely, over the years, pilots always wanted to ensure that, when transmitting, they sounded like Chuck Yeager, or at least like John Wayne. Better to die than sound bad on the radios. Just moments after the Cessna's inquiry, a twin Beech piped up on frequency, in a rather superior tone, asking for his ground speed. "I have you at 125 knots of ground speed." Boy, I thought, the Beechcraft really must think he is dazzling his Cessna brethren. Then out of the blue, a Navy F-18 pilot out of NAS Lemoore came up on frequency. You knew right away it was a Navy jock because he sounded very cool on the radios. "Center, Dusty 52 ground speed check." Before Center could reply, I'm thinking to myself, hey, Dusty 52 has a ground speed indicator in that $1 million cockpit, so why is he asking Center for a readout? Then I got it. Old Dusty here is making sure that every bug smasher from Mount Whitney to the Mojave knows what true speed is. He's the fastest dude in the valley today, and he just wants everyone to know how much fun he is having in his new Hornet. And the reply, always with that same, calm, voice, with more distinct alliteration than emotion. Dusty 52, Center, we have you at 620 on the ground. And I thought to myself, is this a ripe situation, or what? As my hand instinctively reached for the mic button, I had to remind myself that Walt was in control of the radios. Still, I thought, it must be done. In mere seconds we'll be out of the sector and the opportunity will be lost. That Hornet must die, and die now. I thought about all of our sim training and how important it was that we developed well as a crew and knew that to jump in on the radios now would destroy the integrity of all that we had worked toward becoming. I was torn. Somewhere, 13 miles above Arizona, there was a pilot screaming inside his space helmet. Then, I heard it. The click of the mic button from the back seat. That was the very moment that I knew Walter and I had become a crew. Very professionally, and with no emotion, Walter spoke. Los Angeles Center, Aspen 20, can you give us a ground speed check? There was no hesitation, and the replay came as if it was an everyday request. Aspen 20, I show you at 1,842 knots across the ground. I think it was the 42 knots that I liked the best. So accurate and proud was Center to deliver that information without hesitation, and you just knew he was smiling. But the precise point at which I knew that Walt and I were going to be really good friends for a long time was when he keyed the mic once again to say, in his most fighter pilot-like voice, Center, much thanks, we're showing closer to 1900 on the money. For a moment Walter was a god, and we finally heard a little crack in the armor of the Houston Center voice when L.A. came back with, Roger that Aspen, your equipment is probably more accurate than ours. You boys have a good one. It all had lasted for just moments, but in that short, memorable sprint across the Southwest, the Navy had been flamed. All mortal airplanes on frequency were forced to bow before the king of speed, and more importantly, Walter and I had crossed the threshold of being a crew. A fine day's work. We never heard another transmission on that frequency all the way to the coast. For just one day, it truly was fun being the fastest guys out there.